The healing church started as a beacon of hope for the people of Yharnam, but somewhere along the way, it became something far darker, and today we are going to trace exactly how that happened, step by step, from the very first contact with the old blood, all the way to the nightmare that swallowed the city whole. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I want to be upfront about something before we dive in. I made this video because I kept feeling like most discussions of the healing church either start too late in the story or lean too heavily on the Vicar Amelia boss fight as a turning point, which honestly undersells how gradual and almost logical the church's descent was. So when I put this together, I made a deliberate choice to start at the very beginning, with Byrgenwerth, because you cannot understand what the church became without understanding what it was trying to escape from. I also chose to set aside the choir and the upper cathedral ward until later in the video, not because they are less important, but because introducing them too early muddies the timeline. What you are going to hear is one possible reading of the law, assembled from item descriptions, environmental details, and NPC dialogue, and where the evidence is thin, I will say so. Chapter 1. The blood that started everything. There is a lake beneath Yharnam, not a lake of water, but a sea of thick, ancient blood, pooled in the chalice dungeons beneath the city, older than memory, older than the civilization that would eventually be built on top of it. This is where everything begins, not with the healing church, not with Byrgenwerth, but with the simple fact that something was down there long before any human being thought to go looking for it. The Pthumerian civilization came first. They were the original inhabitants of the land, a people who found the Great Ones, and instead of fleeing from them, decided to build a relationship with them. Whether that relationship was worship, study, or something more transactional is not entirely clear. But what is clear is that it involved the old blood. The Pthumerians learned to use it. They built the chalice dungeons as ritual spaces, as places of ceremony and containment, and they passed that knowledge down through generations. For a long time, this seemed to work out for them. Their civilization was advanced, structured, and durable in ways that Yharnam, for all its later grandeur, never quite matched. But the Pthumerians eventually faded. Their civilization did not explode or collapse in a single catastrophe. It dissolved, slowly, into something unrecognizable. The chalice dungeons became tombs, then ruins, then forgotten spaces beneath the earth, where only the desperate or the obsessed would later venture. Whatever the Pthumerians learned from the Great Ones and from the old blood, it was not enough to save them, and that detail matters enormously, because every civilization that comes after them will repeat some version of the same mistake. By the time the scholars of Byrgenwerth arrived on the scene, the Pthumerian ruins were ancient. Nobody alive had a living memory of what that civilization had been. The ruins were archaeological sites, not warnings. And that distinction between a ruin as a historical artifact and a ruin as a cautionary tale is something that Byrgenwerth never quite resolved. They saw the dungeons as a repository of knowledge, waiting to be unlocked. They were not entirely wrong. They were also not even close to being entirely right. Byrgenwerth was an institution of scholars, of academics, who believed that the path to human transcendence ran through knowledge of the Great Ones. This is not a fringe idea within the world of Bloodborne. It is the animating philosophy of almost every powerful faction in the game, including the healing church. The disagreement is always about method, about how you pursue that transcendence, what you are willing to do to get there, and what you are willing to sacrifice. Byrgenwerth believed the answer was the mind, specifically the literal physical expansion of the human brain. More eyes, more perception, more capacity to comprehend the incomprehensible. This is where the eye motif that runs through the entire game originates. Master Willem, the head of Byrgenwerth, led expeditions into the Pthumerian ruins. His scholars catalogued, observed, and eventually began to experiment. It was during one of these expeditions that they found the old blood in a form they could actually use, not just as an artifact or a relic, but as something that could be applied to living human beings. The question of who first proposed actually administering the blood to a person is lost to history, or at least lost to the law fragments that survive. But someone proposed it, and someone agreed. And from that decision, everything else follows. The initial results were remarkable. The old blood healed wounds with a speed that had no natural explanation. It cured ailments that medicine could not touch. It gave people strength and endurance that far exceeded normal human limits. For a scholar community that was already inclined to see the supernatural as a source of power rather than a source of fear, this must have felt like confirmation of everything they believed. The blood was a key. The question was just what door it opened. What Byrgenwerth did not fully account for, or perhaps chose not to account for, was that the blood came with a cost. Not immediately, not obviously. The cost revealed itself slowly, in the gradual behavioral changes of those who had been transfused, in the increasing difficulty of separating the therapeutic use of the blood from the compulsive craving for more of it. The blood was not neutral, it had direction. It pulled people towards something, and that something was not human transcendence in any conventional sense. Within Byrgenwerth, a split was developing. Willem, and at least some of his colleagues, began to grow concerned about the direction of the blood research. They pulled back, or tried to. They emphasized the importance of approaching the great ones with wisdom rather than with hunger. They developed a more cautious philosophy, one that acknowledged the limits of what human beings could safely absorb. This caution was not cowardice. It was, in hindsight, probably correct. On the other side of that split stood a student named Lawrence. Lawrence was brilliant, ambitious, and genuinely convinced that the old blood represented a solution to human suffering, so profound that the risks were worth taking. He was not a cynical man. That is one of the most important things to understand about him. He was not trying to exploit people or build an empire of power for its own sake. He believed in what he was doing. He thought the blood could save people, and that belief is what makes his story and the institution he founded so genuinely tragic. Lawrence and his allies eventually left Byrgenwerth. The departure was not entirely peaceful, and the relationship between the two institutions would remain complicated and hostile for years afterward. But Lawrence left with something that Willem could not take from him, which was the knowledge of the blood and the conviction that it should be shared with the world. He went to Yharnam and he founded the healing church. The city of Yharnam was already there when Lawrence arrived. It was not a blank canvas. It was a real place with a real population, a history, a culture, and existing problems that the arrival of an institution promising miraculous healing would seem to solve perfectly. Yharnam had sick people. It had people with injuries that conventional medicine could not address. It had poor people who could not afford what limited medicine existed. And suddenly, there was an organization offering something that actually worked, something that healed wounds, overnight, that cured diseases without explanation, that gave the weak the strength of the healthy. The healing church did not have to coerce anyone into the early years of its operation. It simply had to exist and offer what it offered, and people came. The cathedral ward became the church's headquarters, and the great cathedral at its centre became the symbolic heart of the institution. Yharnam was rebuilt and expanded around it. Streets were organised to lead toward the church. Architecture was designed to reflect the church's values and its authority. This was not an accident. Every institution that achieves real power shapes the physical spaces it inhabits, and the healing church was no exception. The city and the church became inseparable over time, which meant that when the church began to change, the city would change with it. In the early period, the healing church genuinely helped people. This is not revisionism, and it is not the church's own propaganda. The blood worked as a therapeutic tool when it was administered carefully, in controlled amounts, with appropriate intervals. Wounds healed, diseases retreated, people who had been dying recovered. By any measurable standard, the early healing church was doing what it claimed to be doing, which was healing. The problem was not with the blood's effects. The problem was with what the blood required to keep working, and with what happened when the dose that had been sufficient last month was no longer enough. Lawrence understood the risk of the beast plague before the public ever encountered it. This is one of the darker implications of the law. He knew that prolonged or excessive exposure to the old blood could trigger a transformation in the human body, could turn a person into something that was no longer recognizably human. He knew this, and he chose to continue the distribution program anyway, with safeguards in place that he believed would prevent the worst outcomes. He was gambling, and he knew he was gambling. The question was whether he fully understood how bad the worst case would be. The Healing Church's internal structure developed in ways that reflected these concerns. It was not a flat organization. There were divisions, hierarchies, specialized functions. At the top were the high-ranking clerics and the first vicar, who oversaw doctrine and the administration of the blood. Below them were the hunters, a separate but affiliated institution that the church maintained to deal with the inevitable consequences of blood administration gone wrong. The hunters' workshop, associated with Yharnam and later the church itself, was not an afterthought. It was built in alongside the healing program precisely because someone, presumably Lawrence, understood that healing program would eventually produce things that needed to be hunted. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The Healing Church founded a monster hunting organization at roughly the same time it founded itself. That is not the action of an institution that believed it had found a completely safe solution. It is the action of an institution that knew it was creating a problem and wanted to make sure it had a way to manage that problem before the problem became visible to the public. The hunters were, in a very real sense, damage control from the very beginning. Not just from the very beginning of the beast plague, but from the very beginning of the church. Yharnam's relationship with the early church is complex and not entirely clear from the surviving lore. What we know is that he was associated with the workshop, that he trained hunters, and that he had a personal relationship with a doll that suggests a complicated emotional inner life that we will not fully understand until much later in the story. What matters here is that the hunter tradition, from its origins, was intertwined with the church's operation in ways that made the two institutions codependent. Hunters needed the church's access to the old blood for their own strength and healing. The church needed hunters to clean up the consequences of that access. Neither could easily exist without the other. As the years passed, the Healing Church's relationship with the blood deepened in ways that went beyond simple therapeutics. The church's scholars began to study the blood more intensively, to look for what it could reveal about the Great Ones and about the potential for human transcendence that the Byrgenwerth tradition had always promised. This research strand never disappeared. It ran parallel to the healing ministry, sometimes openly and sometimes more quietly, but it was always there. The church was never just a medical institution. It was always also a research institution, and the research was always pointed towards something beyond ordinary human experience. The founding generation of the church included people who had come directly from Byrgenwerth, who carried that tradition of scholarly inquiry into the new institution. Lawrence himself was Byrgenwerth trained. He brought the questions with him even as he disagreed with Willem about the answers. And the questions were good questions. What are the Great Ones? What is the relationship between the blood and them? Can human beings genuinely approach their level of existence? And if so, how? These are not stupid questions. They are in many ways the most interesting questions that the world of Bloodborne poses. The tragedy is what the pursuit of those questions cost. The first major crisis point came when the beast plague became undeniable. For a period, the church had been managing isolated cases of blood-induced transformation quietly, through the hunters, without public acknowledgement. The infected were taken away, the witnesses were managed, and the official narrative was that the healing program was proceeding safely. But at a certain scale, this kind of concealment becomes impossible. The plague spread faster than the hunters could contain it, and ordinary Yharnamites began to encounter beasts in their neighborhoods, in their buildings, sometimes in their own homes. The church's response to this crisis tells you almost everything about the institution's values at this stage. Rather than acknowledging the connection between the blood and the plague, the church doubled down on the healing program and told the population that the plague was a separate affliction, one that was in fact best treated by further blood administration. This was not a policy born of ignorance. People within the church's leadership knew the truth. This was a policy born of institutional self-preservation, of the determination that the church's authority and mission could not be allowed to be compromised by an admission that the blood itself was dangerous. The people of Yharnam were told a lie, and that lie would cost them everything. Around this time, Lawrence's own transformation, or death, becomes relevant. The exact details of what happened to Lawrence are ambiguous in the law, but by the events of the game, his remains are within the Grand Cathedral, and they are in a state of beasthood. One reading is that Lawrence himself eventually succumbed to the plague that his own institution had helped spread, which is a genuinely devastating irony. The man who genuinely wanted to save people may have become one of the things he spent his life trying to prevent. Whether he knew this was coming, whether he chose it, or whether it simply happened to him against his will, is one of the law's more haunting, unresolved questions. After Lawrence, the church continued to develop, but without his specific vision at the center, it began to fracture into factions that each pursued different aspects of the original mission. The central church maintained the healing ministry and the public-facing religious apparatus, but other branches grew with different emphases, different methods, and increasingly different goals. The choir emerged as the church's most elite scholarly branch, focused on direct engagement with the great ones. The powder kegs developed as a more eccentric technical faction, and the church hunters evolved into something considerably more complicated than the simple damage control mechanism they had started as. What is striking, looking at the early history of the healing church, is how coherent and almost sympathetic the founding logic was. Lawrence was not a monster, Willem was not a fool. The people who built the church and the hunter tradition around it were not acting out of simple greed or hunger for power. They were responding to real human suffering with the best tools they had, making calculated risks that they believed were justified by the potential benefits. The horror of what the church became is inseparable from the genuine good intentions that animated its founding. That combination, good intentions, plus catastrophic consequences, plus institutional self-protection, is the church's true origin story, and it is considerably more disturbing than a straightforward story of evil would be. The last thing to say about this founding period is that by the time the church had fully established itself in Yharnam, the conditions for everything that followed were already in place. The blood was being distributed at scale. The beast plague was a known but concealed risk. The hunters existed to manage the consequences. The scholarly research into the Great Ones was proceeding in parallel, and the church had acquired enough institutional power and popular legitimacy that it could shape reality for the people of Yharnam in ways that individuals or small groups simply could not resist. The church was not yet fully the nightmare it would become, but everything that nightmare needed was already present, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The founding of the healing church is best understood not as a moment of original sin, but as a series of choices, each one individually defensible and collectively catastrophic. Lawrence chose to prioritize access over safety. The church chose concealment over honesty when the plague began to spread. The institution as a whole chose its own survival over the welfare of the people it claimed to serve. None of those choices happened all at once. They accumulated, each one making the next one easier, until the church had become something that its founders, if they had been shown it in advance, would presumably have found unrecognizable. The old blood was always the center of gravity around which everything orbited. It gave the church its power, its purpose, its identity, and ultimately its downfall. Understanding the church means understanding that the blood was never neutral, never just a tool. It had its own agenda, or something like an agenda, something that pulled human beings in a direction that was not of their choosing. The church built itself around that pull and called it healing. What it was actually doing was something considerably harder to name. Every great institution in history has a founding myth, a story it tells about itself that emphasizes the nobility of its origins and the righteousness of its mission. The healing church's founding myth was that it brought healing to a suffering world through the gift of the old blood. The evidence suggests that myth was not entirely false. The church did heal people. It did reduce suffering, at least in the short term, at least for many people. The myth was not a lie from the beginning. It became a lie over time, as the institution's awareness of what the blood cost grew larger, and its willingness to communicate that cost to the people bearing it grew smaller. That transition from genuine mission to self-serving myth is what the next part of this story is about. The healing church's first century or so, if we are interpreting the timeline correctly, was characterized by expansion. More clinics, more healers, more people receiving blood administration, more territory under the church's influence. Success bred confidence, and confidence bred risk-taking. The safeguards that Lawrence had put in place began to erode, not because anyone made a single dramatic decision to remove them, but because each individual relaxation of the rules seemed reasonable in context, justified by local circumstances, approved by local leadership, and never quite serious enough to require escalation to the central church. This is how institutions fail, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in 1,000 small accommodations that individually seem harmless. The beast plague, when it finally became impossible to conceal, was framed by the church not as a consequence of the healing program, but as an external affliction, a judgment or a disease that the healing program was in fact the best response to. This reframing was sophisticated and in many ways effective. People who were afraid of the beasts were told to seek the church's protection. That protection came in the form of more blood, more ministration, more dependence on the institution whose program was causing the problem. The church managed to turn its greatest liability into a source of additional authority. That is a remarkable institutional achievement, and a deeply cynical one. The night of the hunt became a recurring feature of life in Yharnam. Periodically, the plague would intensify, the beasts would become more numerous and more aggressive, and the hunters would be deployed in force. For ordinary Yharnamites, this meant staying inside, locking doors, waiting. The hunters moved through the streets, dealing with what needed to be dealt with. In the morning, the official story would be that the situation had been managed, that the church's protection had held, that the healing program remained the safest path forward. The cycle would then repeat. Each cycle of the night hunt left the city a little more frightened, a little more dependent on the church, and a little more diminished. Population decline was managed by suppressing the numbers, by importing workers from outside Yharnam, by simply not keeping accurate records of who had been lost. The church's authority over information about the plague was as important as its authority over the treatment of it. What people did not know, they could not organize against. What they did not know, they could not grieve in ways that pointed towards systemic accountability. There is a reading of the law that suggests some of the church's leadership genuinely believed the official story, or at least believed a modified version of it. One in which the blood was mostly safe and the plague was mostly manageable, and the occasional failures were acceptable costs. Institutional self-deception is real. People who build something and invest their lives in it develop an enormous capacity to see it charitably. Not everyone who perpetuated the church's deception was consciously lying. Some of them were simply very good at not looking directly at what they were doing. That distinction matters morally, even if it does not change the outcome for the people of Yharnam. The founding chapter of the healing church ends not with a single dramatic event, but with a state of affairs. By the time we can speak of the church as a fully established institution, with its theology, its hierarchy, its public role in Yharnam, and its secret research programs, the essential character of what it would become is already determined. The people making decisions at the top understand more than the people below them. The institution prioritizes its own continuity. The blood is distributed at a scale that makes genuine safety impossible, and the hunters, who were supposed to be the safeguard, have been absorbed into the church's apparatus so thoroughly that they are as much a tool of institutional control as they are a protection for ordinary people. This is the world into which the player character arrives, a world built on decades of accumulated compromise, on the slow drift from mission to self-perpetuation, on the transformation of a genuinely hopeful institution into something that has long since lost the ability to be honest about what it is. The healing church is not an ancient evil. It is something considerably more recognizable than that. It is an institution that started with real purpose, made choices that seemed reasonable in the moment, and ended up somewhere that none of its founders would have chosen to go. That is a story that does not require monsters to be frightening, though it does, in the end, produce quite a few of them. The blood calls to something in human beings that is hard to name and easy to recognize. The need to be healed, to be stronger, to be more than what you are, to transcend the limitations of the body and the mind. The healing church offered to answer that need. In answering it, the church tapped into something that could not be controlled at the scale it was deployed. And the city that hosted the church, Yharnam, paid the price for that miscalculation with everything it had. Every grand cathedral, every cobblestone street, every bell tower, every body left in an alley on a hunt night is a testament to what happens when good intentions meet bad epistemics and institutional self-interest. Welcome to Yharnam. The church is still open, the blood is still available, the hunters are still out, and the night is far from over. The chalice dungeons beneath the city still hold their secrets. The Pthumerian queens still exist in some form in that deeper darkness. And the great ones that started all of this, that the Pthumerians found, and the Byrgenwerth scholars sought, and the healing church built its entire existence around, are still there, vast and incomprehensible, waiting with the patience of things that do not experience time the way human beings do. The church was always downstream from them, whether it knew it or not, and everything the church did, every policy, every cover-up, every night of the hunt, was in some sense a consequence of that original encounter between human curiosity and something that human curiosity was not equipped to safely engage with. That is where the story begins. The next chapter is where it starts to get worse. Chapter 2, Byrgenwerth's Shadow. Long before the healing church commissioned its first cathedral stone, Byrgenwerth was already grappling with questions that it had no business asking and no framework for safely answering. The college sat, removed from the main city, up a long road, behind a locked gate, and that physical separation was not accidental. Byrgenwerth wanted distance from ordinary human society, not because it was ashamed of its work, but because its work required a particular kind of isolation, the kind that allows people to pursue ideas past the point where ordinary social pressure would make them stop. Master Willem is the figure at the centre of Byrgenwerth's story, and he is one of the more genuinely tragic characters in a game full of them. By the time the player encounters him, he is no longer capable of speech in any conventional sense. He sits in a rocking chair at the edge of a lake, diminished and ancient, attended by spider creatures that may have been his students at some earlier point. Whatever he was when he ran Byrgenwerth at its height, he is something else by the time we see him. And yet the things he built, the ideas he championed, the students he trained, are still shaping the world of the game in profound ways. Willem's core belief was that evolution of the mind, specifically the literal expansion of cognitive capacity through more eyes, more perception, was the path to safely engaging with the Great Ones. This is a coherent position within the game's logic. The Great Ones communicate through dreams, through symbols, through modes of experience that ordinary human cognition is poorly equipped to process. The idea that you might need to upgrade your perceptual hardware before engaging with them is not irrational. The problem is in the implementation. How do you expand the human mind? What are you willing to do to achieve that expansion? And what do you become in the process? The Byrgenwerth scholars who went into the Chalice dungeons were not explorers in the casual sense. They were people with a specific kinds of knowledge and bringing back specific kinds of materials. The old blood was among what they found. But it was not the only thing. They also found Pthumerian artifacts, Pthumerian ritual objects, and evidence of the Pthumerians' own engagement with the Great Ones, which was more direct, more physical, and more dangerous than even Byrgenwerth's most ambitious programs. The dungeons were a library, and Byrgenwerth was reading as fast as it could. What Byrgenwerth did with the blood in its early research period is not fully documented in the lore we have access to. but several things are implied. There were experiments on human subjects within the college itself. There were transformations that were not always voluntary or controlled. There were cases of what we would recognize as early beast plague that Byrgenwerth dealt with in its own way, which was probably not with a medical ethics board. The college had the detachment from social norms that its physical isolation was designed to enable, and it used that detachment. Lawrence was a student at Byrgenwerth during this period. He absorbed everything the college had to offer, including its genuine intellectual rigor, its willingness to engage with the most dangerous questions, and its methods. What he eventually rejected was not the ambition, but the caution. Or more precisely, he rejected what he saw as Willem's excessive caution, the old master's increasingly restrictive approach to what could be done with the blood, and why. Lawrence thought Willem was letting fear interfere with progress. Looking at the history, Willem was arguably not being nearly afraid enough. The specific disagreement that caused the split between Lawrence and Willem is crystallized in a single item description from the game, a small piece of text that tells you an enormous amount. Willem feared the beast plague that would result from misuse of the blood. Lawrence disagreed with how to handle that risk. One possible reading is that Lawrence thought the risk could be managed, that with proper protocols and proper distribution, the benefits of the blood would outweigh the danger of the plague. Another possible reading is that Lawrence thought the risk was simply worth taking, that the scale of potential benefit justified the scale of potential harm. These are different positions. Both of them are positions that someone brilliant and well-intentioned could hold. Neither of them turned out to be correct. When Lawrence left and founded the Healing Church, he did not sever his relationship with Byrgenwerth entirely. The two institutions remained in contact, sometimes cooperatively and sometimes adversarially, for years after the split. Byrgenwerth continued its own research program, increasingly focused on the perceptual and cognitive dimensions of Great One contact, rather than the physical and blood-based dimensions. Willem's influence pushed the college in a direction that was less about biological transformation and more about something like philosophical or perceptual preparation for contact with entities that existed outside ordinary human experience. The lake at Byrgenwerth is one of the game's more evocative locations, and it points towards something that the college eventually found or made contact with. The vacuous spider, encountered in that lake, is a great one, or at least a creature that has been elevated to something like Great One status through Byrgenwerth's experiments. Rom's presence suggests that Willem and his colleagues did, eventually, achieve some form of the contact with higher entities that they had been pursuing. The question is what that contact cost them, and whether the result was anything like what they had hoped for. Rom serves a specific function in the game's cosmology. She maintains a veil of illusion over certain realities, specifically the reality of Eden Chapel and the presence of the amygdala in Yharnam that most residents cannot perceive. One reading of this is that Rom's role is protective in some sense, that the illusion she maintains shields ordinary people from a reality that would destroy them. Another reading is that it is suppressive, that Rom's veil prevents people from seeing the truth of what has happened to their world and responding to it. These readings are not mutually exclusive. The Byrgenwerth tradition continued to influence the Healing Church even after the formal split, because so many of the church's founders were Byrgenwerth alumni. The church's scholarly wing, which eventually developed into the choir, was doing work that was fundamentally continuous with what Byrgenwerth had been doing, just with more resources, more subjects, and less academic restraint. The choir's experiments on orphaned children, their attempts to engineer direct contact with the Great Ones, their use of the eye of a blood-drunk hunter, all of these programs have intellectual roots in Byrgenwerth's original research agenda. Willem himself seems to have eventually reached a kind of limit. The figure we encounter at the game's events suggests someone who pursued his questions to their end and found that the end was not what he had hoped. He is transformed, diminished, surrounded by the remnants of students who did not survive their own transformations intact. The lake at his feet holds something vast and ancient that his institution made contact with. Whether he considers this a success or a failure is something his current state of being makes impossible to determine. What Byrgenwerth ultimately represents in the larger narrative is the origin of a particular kind of intellectual hubris, the belief that the right kind of preparation and the right kind of rigor can make engagement with the incomprehensible safe. This belief is wrong in the world of Bloodborne. The Great Ones are not problems to be solved with better methodology. They are entities whose existence operates on a level that human intellectual frameworks, however sophisticated, cannot adequately contain. Every institution that tries to engage with them on their own terms ends up being changed by that engagement in ways that were not planned and cannot be reversed. The Chalice dungeons that Byrgenwerth excavated are worth considering separately from the college's above-ground work. Down in those ruins, beneath the city, the scholars encountered things that had been sealed away for very good reasons. The Perfumerian queens were not dormant. They were not dead. They were in a state that is hard to categorize, maintained by rituals and by the blood itself, somewhere between life and something else. Byrgenwerth's intrusion into that space disturbed something. Whether it disturbed it in a way that had immediate consequences, or in a way that would take generations to manifest, is one of the law's more interesting open questions. The relationship between the blood and the Great Ones is something that Byrgenwerth understood better than almost any other institution. The blood is not simply a medical substance. It is, in some sense, a connection, a biological link between human beings and the Great Ones whose origin it traces back to. When you administer the old blood to a human being, you are not simply introducing a healing agent. You are establishing a relationship between that person and something that exists on a level they cannot fully comprehend. Byrgenwerth knew this. Willem knew this. And this knowledge is probably part of what made him eventually want to stop. The tension between Byrgenwerth's intellectual tradition and the healing church's more practical mission created a productive but unstable energy in Yharnam's intellectual culture. The scholars who stayed at Byrgenwerth continued to push toward cognitive and perceptual transcendence. The scholars who joined the church pushed toward biological and physical access to the Great One's power. Both trajectories were dangerous. Both produced genuine insights, and both eventually contributed to the catastrophe that swallowed Yharnam. One of the more underappreciated aspects of Byrgenwerth's legacy is the specific way it shaped the church's attitude toward knowledge. Byrgenwerth was an institution that believed some knowledge was too important to withhold, and also too dangerous to share widely. It cultivated secrecy, not out of greed, but out of a genuine belief that ordinary people were not equipped to handle what the college had learned. The healing church inherited this attitude completely and applied it in ways that were far more consequential because the church operated at a much larger scale and wielded much more social authority. The secret knowledge structure of the healing church, the fact that different levels of the hierarchy had access to different information, that the public face of the church was carefully constructed to conceal what the inner workings actually involved, that the highest levels of the church were pursuing goals that would have horrified the ordinary Yharnamites, making donations and seeking blood ministration. All of this is Byrgenwerth's epistemology applied to a mass institution. Willem's belief that not everyone could handle the truth became the church's organizational principle. The difference is that Byrgenwerth was a small college of scholars, experimenting on themselves and a limited number of subjects. The church was experimenting on an entire city. The students that Byrgenwerth lost to failed experiments, to transformations that went wrong, to the inevitable costs of the research program, are the template for what Yharnam would eventually become. The difference is scale. The lake that holds Rom holds the secret of what Byrgenwerth ultimately achieved, or failed to achieve. And the healing church, which inherited Byrgenwerth's questions and ambitions while rejecting its caution, simply applied the same logic at a level that could not be contained. Willem's final gesture in the game, pointing toward the lake after the player encounters him, is ambiguous in the way that most of Bloodborne's lore is ambiguous. He might be pointing toward Rom as a warning. He might be pointing toward the source of the knowledge that cost him everything. He might simply be pointing because it is the only thing he can still do. What is clear is that, whatever Byrgenwerth pursued, it did not end well for Byrgenwerths. And what the healing church built on Byrgenwerth's foundations did not end well for Yharnam. The shadow that Byrgenwerth cast over the game's world is long and dark, and it reaches through the church, through the chalice dungeons, through the dreams and nightmares that structure the game's cosmology, all the way to the moment the player character wakes up and the night of the hunt begins. The intellectual tradition that started at Byrgenwerth was not inherently evil. It was genuinely curious, genuinely rigorous, and genuinely motivated by some of the most interesting questions you can ask about the nature of existence. What it lacked was the wisdom to know when to stop. What it lacked was a robust framework for evaluating the cost of its pursuits against the value of what it found. It treated knowledge as an unconditional good and treated the people who were exposed to the consequences of pursuing that knowledge as acceptable collateral. That pattern, curiosity without adequate ethical constraint, would define everything that came after it. Byrgenwerth's shadow is also the shadow of a specific intellectual personality type. The brilliant person who is so committed to understanding that they lose track of why understanding was supposed to matter in the first place. Willem wanted to elevate humanity. Lawrence wanted to heal it. Both of them ended up contributing to its destruction. Not because they were stupid or wicked, but because they were pursuing genuine goods without adequate attention to what those goods cost. That is not a comfortable lesson. It is not a lesson that allows you to draw clean lines between heroes and villains. It is the kind of lesson that the world of Bloodborne is very specifically designed to teach. The lake, the gate, the rocking chair, the spider in the water. These images cluster together in a way that suggests not just a physical location, but a symbol for what happens when you push knowledge to its limit and find that the limit pushes back. Byrgenwerth found something at the bottom of its inquiry. Whatever it found, it was not what it expected. And the institution that grew from Byrgenwerth's teachings, the Healing Church, would make exactly the same discovery on a vastly larger scale, with vastly larger consequences, and would respond to it in exactly the same way that Byrgenwerth ultimately did, by discovering that you cannot make a safe container for something that does not recognize the concept of a container. The founding of the Healing Church begins at Byrgenwerth, not in the sense that Willem intended it, but in the sense that the questions Byrgenwerth asked and the methods it used to pursue them are the DNA of everything the church became. You cannot understand what the church did without understanding where it came from. And where it came from is a locked gate, an ivy-covered building, a lake that holds something vast and ancient, and a very old man pointing at the water. That is the beginning. The church took that beginning and built a cathedral out of it. Whether that was an improvement is something the ruins of Yharnam can answer better than any document. Chapter 3. The Blood Ministry, the practical operation of the Healing Church's blood ministry, is something that the game gives us information about in fragments, scattered across item descriptions, and the occasional NPC who is willing to talk about it. Assembling those fragments into a coherent picture requires some interpretive choices, and those choices are worth being explicit about. What follows is one possible reconstruction of how the blood ministry actually worked, who it served, how it was administered, and what it cost the people who received it. The basic structure was straightforward in principle. The church maintained a network of healing clinics throughout Yharnam, staffed by church healers who had been trained in the administration of blood ministration. Patients would come to these clinics, would be assessed, and would receive an appropriate amount of blood. The blood used in the clinics was not the raw old blood from the chalice dungeons, but a refined and diluted product, processed by church alchemists to reduce its more extreme effects while preserving its healing properties. Or, at least, that was the theory. The refinement process was genuinely sophisticated. The church's alchemists understood, at least in principle, that the potency of the old blood needed to be calibrated to the individual recipient and to the nature of the condition being treated. Too little, and the healing effect would be insufficient. Too much, and the risk of transformation began to climb in ways that were difficult to predict or control. The art of blood ministration was, in theory, about finding the right dose for the right patient at the right time. In practice, this calibration was imperfect and became less perfect over time as demand grew and the supply chain stretched. The supply of the old blood came from two primary sources. The first was the chalice dungeons, where church expeditions continued to collect blood from sources deep in the Pthumerian ruins. The second was the church's own research facilities, where scholars were developing methods of cultivating and refining the blood in ways that would eventually become the basis for the more extreme experiments conducted by the choir. The logistical challenge of maintaining this supply chain, of ensuring that the blood reaching the clinics was appropriately refined and properly stored, was enormous, and was handled by a dedicated administrative apparatus within the church that most ordinary Yharnamites never knew existed. The social structure of blood ministration in Yharnam deserves attention. Access to the blood was not uniform across the population. The poorest residents of the city had access to the basic healing clinics, but the quality and quantity of blood available to them was lower than what was available to wealthier patrons who made substantial donations to the church. This was not officially acknowledged as a tiered system, but it functioned as one. The rich got better blood, administered more carefully, with more follow-up attention. The poor got what was left, administered more quickly, with less individual calibration. This disparity had consequences. The beast plague, when it spread, did not spread evenly across all social classes. The poorer quarters of Yharnam, where the blood was less refined and the ministry less careful, were the first places where the plague became visible, and the most severely affected. This created a convenient narrative for the church, which could point to the affected areas and suggest that the problem was not with the blood itself, but with the populations receiving it, with their supposed inability to properly process the gift they had been given. This was, to be direct about it, a lie that the church told itself and its wealthier adherents to avoid confronting the implications of its own supply chain failures. The healers who staffed the clinics occupy an interesting position in the moral landscape of the church. Many of them were not in on the deeper knowledge of what the blood actually was and what it could do. They were trained to administer it, to monitor for adverse reactions, and to report serious cases upward through the hierarchy. What happened after serious cases were reported? The fact that those cases were quietly removed rather than treated in any medical sense was not something most frontline healers were told. The institutional structure of the church was designed to ensure that the people who had direct contact with patients did not need to know the things that would make their work impossible to do in good conscience. This compartmentalization was not unique to the healing church. It is a feature of many institutions that do harmful things at scale. The people at the bottom carry out their specific functions without full knowledge of what those functions contribute to in the aggregate. The people at the top have the full picture, but have insulated themselves from the direct human cost through layers of institutional hierarchy. The result is that nobody feels fully responsible, because nobody at any given level has both the full knowledge and the direct contact with consequences that would make full responsibility easy to assign. Byrgenwerth gave the church its intellectual framework. Institutional self-preservation gave it this organizational logic. The cathedral ward clinics were the most prestigious and the most carefully run of the church's healing facilities. Patients who came there received the best version of what the church had to offer, administered by healers who had the most training and access to the most refined blood. These clinics were also the most visible part of the church's public face, the places where wealthy donors and civic leaders could see the healing mission in its most flattering light. They were, in a meaningful sense, the church's showroom, the version of itself that it wanted to be seen as, the reality of what happened in the lower city clinics, in the foreign clinics, in the increasingly desperate ministrations performed on people who were already showing early signs of transformation, was not part of that showroom presentation. Foreign visitors who came to Yharnam seeking the blood ministration were an important part of the church's operation, both as a revenue source and as a kind of proof of concept for the healing ministry's effectiveness. The church actively encouraged Yharnam's reputation as a place of miraculous healing to spread beyond the city's walls, because each new patient who arrived from outside confirmed the institution's purpose and its legitimacy. The player character is one of these foreign visitors, arriving in Yharnam seeking blood ministration for an unspecified illness and being absorbed into the night of the hunt before they can fully process what they've gotten themselves into. What happened to foreign visitors who showed adverse reactions to the blood is one of the darker practical implications of the ministry's operation. The church could not simply send them home. A person undergoing transformation, or even showing early signs of it, could not be allowed to leave Yharnam and spread both the plague and the knowledge of its connection to the blood ministration beyond the city's walls. The practical solution to this problem is left implicit in the law, but the implication is not a comfortable one. Foreign patients who came for healing and instead became problems were dealt with in ways that would not make it into the church's promotional materials. The economic dimension of the blood ministry is important and often underemphasized in law discussions. The church was not simply an institution of healing, it was an economic institution of enormous importance to the city of Yharnam. The blood ministry generated revenue through donations, through fees for higher quality ministrations, and through the commerce that the church's reputation for miraculous healing attracted to the city in the form of foreign patients and their attendants and their money. The city's economy was structured around the church in ways that made it extremely difficult for any individual or group within Yharnam to challenge the institution, because challenging the church meant challenging the economic foundation of the city itself. This economic dependency is part of why ordinary Yharnamites who might have had doubts about the blood ministry found it so difficult to act on those doubts. The church was not just a religious and medical institution. It was the largest employer in the city, the largest property owner, the primary source of both physical healing and economic stability. To oppose it was to risk your livelihood, your access to medicine, your social standing, and your physical safety. The hunters were, after all, an arm of the church, and hunters who were dealing with the beast plague might find it convenient to deal with public dissenters. At the same time, the structural conditions for dissent simply did not exist in Yharnam in any meaningful way. The blood's addictive properties are something the church managed rather than acknowledged. People who received blood administration regularly found that stopping was extremely difficult, that their bodies and minds had developed a need for continued administration that was not simply physical dependence in the conventional sense. The blood changed people, even in subtransformative doses. It heightened their senses, altered their perception, made them more aware of things at the edges of ordinary experience. These effects were not uniformly negative, at least not immediately. Many people found them pleasurable, clarifying, even spiritually meaningful. The church encouraged this interpretation, framing the blood's effects as evidence of its sacred nature. This framing of addiction as spiritual experience is one of the church's most insidious achievements. By teaching people that their craving for more blood was a sign of spiritual sensitivity rather than physical dependency, the church transformed a problem into an asset. People who were addicted to the blood were not addicted people in need of help. They were faithful adherents whose bodies had been open to higher experience. This reframing made it very difficult for individuals to identify their own dependence as a problem, and it made it culturally impossible for the community to discuss the issue honestly, because to question the spiritual interpretation of the blood's effects was to question the church's entire theological framework. The transformation of blood administration into a religious sacrament was a gradual process that was probably complete well before the period the game takes place in. By the time of the game, the blood is not simply a medical treatment in Yharnam. It is a sacred substance, a gift from something divine, a connection to a higher order of reality. The church's priests administer it in ceremonies that have the character of religious ritual. The healers who work in the clinics are ordained figures, not simply medical professionals. The entire apparatus of blood distribution has been wrapped in theological language and ceremonial practice that makes it much harder to evaluate on purely practical terms. This sacralization of the blood served the church's interests perfectly. An institution that offers medicine can be evaluated on the basis of medical outcomes. An institution that offers sacraments is evaluated on the basis of faith. And faith, by definition, does not respond to empirical challenges in the same way. When people began to notice problems with the blood ministry, its connection to the plague, its uneven distribution, its addictive effects, the Church had a powerful rhetorical response available. Your doubts are a failure of faith. The person who questions the blood is the problem, not the blood. This response was not always articulated so boldly, but the institutional culture produced it reliably. The organization of the Church's clergy reflected the theology of blood and the practical requirements of running the ministry. At the top were the high clerics and the vicar, figures of enormous religious and administrative authority. Below them were various orders of priests and healers. The hunters operated as a parallel but subordinate hierarchy, theoretically under church authority, but with their own internal culture and their own relationship to the blood and to the violence that the ministry required. Understanding how these different branches interacted, where authority was clear and where it was contested, is important for understanding how the Church functioned as a whole. The vicar was the public face of the Church's religious authority, a figure who combined the roles of spiritual leader, institutional head, and keeper of the Church's most secret knowledge. Vicar Amelia, the one we encounter in the game, is a woman who has undergone a transformation that is, at least in her final form, indistinguishable from the beast plague that the Church officially claims to be fighting. The sight of the Church's highest visible official transformed into a beast is not an accident or an irony the game presents casually. It is a statement about the relationship between the Church's public identity and its actual nature. The specifics of blood ministration at the clinical level also included something that the Church called the right of watchers, or something like it. Patients who were deemed to have potential beyond simple healing, who showed unusual sensitivity to the blood's effects, or unusual capacity to absorb larger doses without adverse reaction, were sometimes identified for special programs. These programs were not offered to everyone. They were offered to people the Church identified as having particular value to its research agenda. Being selected for a special program was presented as an honor. Whether it was an honor in any sense that the participant would retrospectively agree with is a different question. The clinical workers who identified candidates for these programs were not always told what the programs involved. They were told to look for certain signs in patients during ministration, certain patterns of response, certain physical or behavioral indicators that the Church's researchers had determined were meaningful. They were not told why those signs were meaningful or what would happen to the patients who displayed them. The clinical staff were, again, compartmentalized, given enough information to do their specific jobs, and no more. This was the Church's standard operational model applied at the clinical level. By the time the beast plague was fully established as a periodic feature of life in Yharnam, the blood ministry had become so integrated into the city's social and economic life that imagining Yharnam without it was nearly impossible. The ministry was not just a feature of the city, it was part of the city's identity, part of its self-conception, part of what made Yharnamites feel that they were part of something significant. The Church had successfully made itself not just useful, but essential. Not just essential, but sacred. That transformation, from useful institution to sacred necessity, is the blood ministry's greatest achievement and its most profound contribution to Yharnam's eventual destruction. The people who kept the blood ministry running on a day-to-day basis were ordinary people doing what they understood to be good work, healers who spent their days helping sick people, administrators who kept the supply chain functioning, clerics who provided pastoral support to people frightened by the changes the blood was making in their world. Most of them were not villains. Most of them were doing the best they could within a system that was designed to make it very difficult to see the full picture. That is perhaps the most disturbing thing about the blood ministry and the institution behind it. It did not require evil people to do evil things. It required ordinary people to do ordinary things, within a structure that was itself the problem. Chapter 4. The Hunters and Their Workshop. The Hunters' Workshop was never truly independent of the Healing Church, but it maintained something like independence for long enough that its internal culture developed in ways that distinguished hunters from the Church's other servants. Understanding the hunters means understanding both the tradition that Gehrman established and the ways that tradition was gradually absorbed, modified, and ultimately compromised by its relationship with the institution it nominally served. Gehrman was the first hunter, or at least the first hunter of the particular tradition that the game focuses on. He was a figure of genuine skill and, apparently, considerable personal warmth, given what we learn about his relationship with the doll and with the people he trained. The workshop he ran was a real place, a physical space where hunters gathered, where weapons were crafted and maintained, where knowledge about the beasts and how to fight them was accumulated and shared. The physical workshop was destroyed at some point before the game's events, but its spiritual successor persists in the hunter's nightmare and in the dream space where Gehrman still serves his function. The weapons developed at the workshop reflect a sophisticated understanding of what the hunters were fighting and what they needed to fight effectively. The trick weapons, those blades and guns and bludgeons that could transform between different configurations, were an engineering response to the variety of threats that hunters encountered. A weapon that worked well against one type of beast might be inadequate against another. The trick weapon system gave hunters flexibility, allowed them to adapt mid-combat, to shift between configurations, depending on what a situation required. This flexibility was practical, but it also carried a philosophical implication. The idea that the hunter's art was about adaptation, about reading a situation and responding to what was actually there, rather than what you expected. The hunter's relationship with the old blood was complicated from the beginning. Hunters needed the blood's healing properties to survive the injuries that hunting inevitably produced. A hunter who could not quickly heal from wounds would not be a hunter for long. The church supplied the blood, and hunters used it, and this created a dependency that went beyond the simple employer-employee relationship. Hunters were physically dependent on the blood in ways that tied them to the institution that supplied it, regardless of what they might think of that institution's other activities. The early hunters operated with something like ethical clarity that later generations increasingly lacked. The targets were clear: people who had transformed to the point where they were dangerous to others, beasts who had lost whatever connection they once had to their human identity. The question of when a person had crossed the line into being a legitimate target for hunters was handled differently by different hunters, but the workshop tradition maintained at least a nominal commitment to the idea that the hunting had a purpose beyond killing for its own sake. Hunters were supposed to be protecting people. That protective mission became harder to maintain as the church's relationship with the hunters deepened. The more the church relied on hunters not just to deal with beast plague victims, but to manage information, to deal with people who knew too much, to enforce the church's authority in situations where its religious and social authority was insufficient, the harder it became for individual hunters to maintain the ethical clarity that the workshop tradition had originally promised. Hunters who raised questions about what they were being asked to do found those questions unwelcome. Hunters who refused assignments found that their access to supplies, to blood, to the institutional support that made their work possible, suddenly became unreliable. Alfred is a character in the game who represents a particular endpoint of the hunter tradition's corruption. He is devoted to Executioner Ludwig and to the mission of purging the vile bloods, an obsession that has squeezed out almost everything else that might have made him a rounded person. He is not a stupid man or a cruel one in any simple sense. He is a true believer, someone who is committed so completely to the church's framing of what hunters are supposed to do that he cannot see past it. His violence is not recreational, it is devotional, and that devotional quality makes it worse, not better, because it removes the possibility of doubt that might otherwise create an opening for reconsideration. The Cainhurst vile bloods, and the conflict between them and the church's hunters, is a thread that illuminates something important about how the church used its hunter apparatus for purposes beyond the official mission. The vile bloods were a separate source of blood, a blood that the church declared impure, and that the executioners, a church-aligned hunter order, were tasked with eradicating. Whether the vile blood was actually more dangerous than the church's own blood is not clearly established in the law. What is established is that the vile blood represented competition, an alternative source of the substance that was the foundation of the church's authority. The church's hostility to the vile bloods was not purely theological. It was territorial. The blood-drunk hunter phenomenon is one of the most important and most disturbing aspects of the hunter tradition. Prolonged exposure to the blood through hunting, through contact with beast blood and through the use of blood healing during combat, eventually produced a specific kind of degradation in hunters. The blood intoxicated them in ways that made them progressively less able to distinguish between legitimate targets and innocent people. A blood-drunk hunter was not simply a dangerous person. They were a hunter whose original purpose had been dissolved by the very substance they used to pursue it. Simon the Harrowed is a character who understood the blood-drunk problem from the inside. He was a hunter who had seen colleagues go blood-drunk and had managed at some cost to himself to maintain enough clarity to avoid the worst of it. His testimony about what it feels like to feel the pull of blood-drunkenness and what it costs to resist it is one of the more honest accounts the game provides of what the hunter life actually involved. He survived the night described in the game, which is more than can be said for most hunters. The hunter's nightmare is both the literal space in the game and a symbol for what the hunter tradition produced in its worst iterations. It is a space full of hunters who have long since lost any purpose beyond the hunt itself, who exist in a kind of eternal bloody present that has no goal and no end. These are hunters who were so shaped by their function that when the function lost its context, they could not stop. The hunt continued because the hunt was all they were. This is what complete absorption by an institution does to individuals over time. It eliminates the parts of them that exist outside their function. Gehrman's position in the hunter tradition is a paradox. He is the original hunter, the founder of the workshop, the man who trained generations of the people who went out and dealt with the beast plague. He is also the keeper of a dream space that exists to absorb hunters who have died in service and give them somewhere to be, which is either a compassionate act or a trap, depending on how you look at it. The moon presence, the great one that binds Gehrman to the dream, is using him, and through him using the hunters who come to the workshop in ways that Gehrman may or may not fully understand. Gehrman's sadness is one of the game's most quietly devastating details. He is old, he is weary, he is bound to a service that he did not choose in any meaningful sense, and he has watched generations of hunters come through his workshop and go out into the night and mostly not come back. He has a doll, a simulacrum of a person who was important to him because the real person is gone and the doll is the best substitute available in the dream space. This is not a portrait of triumphant founding. This is a portrait of what the founding cost. The workshop's weapons and tools tell a story about what knowledge the hunters accumulated over generations. The bestiary of creature types that the weapons were designed to address reflects a progressive understanding of the varieties of transformation that the old blood could produce. Early weapons were relatively simple because the early hunters were dealing with relatively simple forms of the beast plague. As the plague's manifestations diversified and intensified, the weapon designs responded. The final generation of hunter weapons, the ones available in the game, reflects centuries of accumulated experience with creatures that no longer resemble anything easily categorized, the church hunters specifically, as distinct from the independent workshop tradition, occupied a more explicitly ecclesiastical role. They were armed clergy as much as they were trained combatants. Their armor reflected church aesthetics. Their missions were authorized by church authority. Their relationship with the blood was managed through church institutions rather than through the workshop. These distinctions mattered for how church hunters understood their work and what constraints they felt on how they carried it out. Eileen the Crow represents a tradition of hunter that pursued a different kind of mission, specifically the hunting of other hunters who had gone blood-drunk. This is a profound acknowledgement that the hunter tradition itself produced a category of threat that then required a specialist to address. The existence of hunters who hunt hunters is an institutional feedback loop that reveals something important about where the tradition's limits were. The workshop had created a necessary role in the city, had trained people to fill that role, had supplied them with the tools and the blood to do it, and had eventually produced enough failures in that role that a new role had to be created to manage the failures. This is not a stable equilibrium. It is a spiral. The physical destruction of the original workshop, which happened at some point before the game begins, is significant as an institutional event. The workshop was not absorbed into the church. It was not officially closed, it was destroyed, and the circumstances of that destruction are not entirely clear. What is clear is that by the time of the game, the independent hunter tradition that Gehrman had established no longer has a physical home in the waking world. It exists only in the dream, as an archive of what it was, rather than a living institution. The church has not replaced it so much as outlasted it. The hunters who operate in Yharnam during the game's night are not, for the most part, workshop tradition hunters in any meaningful sense. They are people who have taken up the hunt for various personal reasons and who have inherited the tools and some of the knowledge without necessarily inheriting the tradition's original values or purposes. The network of messages and clues left by past hunters that the player can find throughout the game suggests a community of people who are trying to preserve something important, to pass knowledge on to whoever came after them, in the recognition that the institutions they had relied on could not be trusted to do that preservation themselves. The hunter tradition began as a pragmatic response to the beast plague and ended as a complex of institutions, sub-traditions and individual practitioners that had long since lost the coherence of their original purpose. What held them together was not a shared mission or a shared loyalty to any institution, but a shared set of tools and a shared relationship with the blood and the night. In the game, that reduced set of common elements is enough to create something like community among the scattered survivors of the hunter tradition. Whether it is enough to accomplish anything meaningful against what Yharnam has become is the question the game poses without fully answering. The workshop's legacy is ultimately inseparable from the church's legacy because the two institutions grew up together and shaped each other in ways that neither fully intended. The church needed hunters and made them dependent. The hunters needed the blood and accepted dependency. Each institution modified the other by that mutual need. The result was not what Gehrman designed or what Lawrence intended. It was what emerged from the collision of two different visions of how to handle an impossible situation. And the collision, as it turned out, produced something that satisfied neither vision and that eventually consumed both of them. Chapter 5. The Choir and the Upper Cathedral Ward. The choir is the healing church's inner sanctum, its most elite and most secret division, and it is where the gap between the church's public mission and its actual activities becomes most apparent. By the time you reach the Upper Cathedral Ward in the game, you have already seen a great deal of what the church has produced in the world below. What you find in the ward suggests that everything you have seen so far was only the surface of what the institution was doing. The choir occupied the upper reaches of the cathedral ward, physically above the rest of the city, which is not accidental. Height in Yharnam's architecture corresponds to privilege, to access, to proximity to the things the church considered most sacred. The ordinary citizens live at street level. The healers and lower clergy live in the cathedral ward proper. The choir lived above even that, in spaces that most Yharnamites would never visit and could not access. The physical separation was a spatial representation of the institutional separation between what the church showed the world and what it was actually doing. The choir's primary research focus was direct contact with the Great Ones, specifically engineered contact that went beyond the indirect relationship mediated by the old blood. The blood had always been understood, at least by those at the top of the church, as a connection to something vast and non-human. The choir wanted to take that connection and make it deliberate, controlled, and escalated. They wanted to see the Great Ones and to see the knowledge those entities possessed, and they were willing to do, essentially, anything to achieve that. The experiments on orphans that the choir conducted are among the most disturbing details in the game's lore. The orphanage within the Upper Cathedral Ward was not a charitable institution, despite whatever name it bore. It was a research facility that used children as subjects, specifically because children's developing minds and bodies were hypothesized to be more receptive to the kind of modification the choir wanted to achieve. The choir believed that the right biological preparation in early life would create individuals who could make contact with the Great Ones more directly and more safely than adults who had already formed the cognitive structures that made comprehension of Great One reality difficult. Whether the research worked, in the narrow sense that it produced individuals who had the expanded perceptual capacity the choir was seeking, is implied by the celestial children and similar entities encountered in the game. These are beings whose development was modified by church experiments, whose relationship with ordinary human experience has been fundamentally altered. Whether they are better off for the alteration is not a question the game encourages you to ask in any comfortable way. They are what they are, and what they are is profoundly different from what they would have been without the church's intervention. The upper cathedral ward's architecture reflects the choir's mission. It is not simply Gothic ecclesiastical space with religious decoration. It is a functional research environment disguised as a church. The spaces have purposes beyond ceremony. The arrangement of rooms suggests a process, a progression from one type of activity to another. The aesthetic of the ward is genuinely beautiful, in the austere way of very old stone buildings, but that beauty exists in service of something that the beauty makes harder to see clearly. The celestial emissary encountered in the ward is one of the more explicit statements about what the choir's research produced. These are beings that are explicitly trying to be something more than human, or that have been made into something that the choir hoped would be more than human. Their appearance, small and odd and numerous, clustered around a central form that grows enormous when sufficiently provoked, suggests a kind of collectivity, a many bodies one consciousness structure that echoes the way the Great Ones seem to exist simultaneously on multiple levels. Whether this similarity to Great One existence was the intended outcome of the experiments is unclear. Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, is the centerpiece of the upper cathedral ward and the most significant product or discovery that the choir ever worked with. Ebrietas is a great one, or something extremely close to one, and she is present in the ward in a way that suggests the choir had established a relationship with her before the events of the game. The nature of that relationship is ambiguous. She is described as having been left behind when other great ones departed, which suggests she may have chosen to remain in contact with the church, rather than the church having captured or contained her. One reading of the Ebrietas situation is that the choir genuinely achieved something remarkable, that they established contact with a great one on terms that were, for a time, mutually acceptable. If Ebrietas chose to remain, if she found the relationship with the choir valuable in some way, that would represent a genuine accomplishment that goes well beyond what Byrgenwerth ever managed. The problem is that by the time you encounter her in the game, the relationship, whatever it was, has broken down. She attacks the player on sight, which is not the behavior of an entity that is at peace with its situation. Another reading is that Ebrietas was never really in agreement with anything, that she remained because the ward was, for her own reasons, a place she was willing to be, and that the choir interpreted her presence as cooperation or consent when it was actually simply tolerance. This reading aligns with the general pattern of the healing church, attributing meanings to the Great One's behaviors that serve the church's narrative needs, rather than accurately reflecting what the Great Ones actually want or experience. The church's pattern of motivated interpretation applies here as it applies everywhere else. The choir's access to the blood was qualitatively different from what was distributed through the healing clinics. The choir used formulations of the blood that were more direct, less refined, closer to the source. The effects of these formulations on the scholars who used them were accordingly more extreme. A choir scholar who had been working at the upper level of the church's research program for any significant period of time was almost certainly a substantially different person from what they had been when they began. The changes were not random. They were in the direction that the choir's own research predicted they would go, which suggests that the choir's self-experimentation was itself part of the research program, rather than an accidental byproduct. The distinction between the choir and the lower church is not just organizational, it is cosmological. The choir understood, or believed it understood, the relationship between the old blood and the great ones in a way that the lower church's theology only gestured at. Where ordinary church theology spoke of the blood as a divine gift, a sacred substance given by higher beings, the choir's internal understanding was more specific and more uncomfortable. The blood was a connection, not a gift. It was a substance that linked human beings to entities whose relationship to human concepts of benevolence or divinity was fundamentally uncertain. Using it was establishing a relationship with something you could not fully understand or control. The choir knew this and did it anyway. The moon presence's influence on the choir's activities is an area where the law is thin but suggestive. The moon presence is a great one that seems particularly interested in managing human access to insight, specifically in preventing human beings from achieving the kind of transcendence that would make them something other than useful subjects for Great One purposes. If the moon presence was influencing the choir's research agenda, it was not doing so in ways that would actually allow the choir to achieve its stated goals. The moon presence's interests and the choir's stated interests were not necessarily aligned. Lugarius and the executioners represent a branch of church hunter that was directed specifically by the choir against the vile bloods of Cainhurst. The mission was framed as holy war against blood that the church deemed impure. The practical effect was the destruction of an alternative source of blood-related power that the church could not control. Logarius's eventual choice to remain at Cainhurst Castle after the massacre, sealing himself there to prevent a vile blood queen from accessing something important, suggests that the mission had complications that the church's official framing did not capture. What Logarius knew that made him willing to sacrifice himself in that way is one of the law's more intriguing, unresolved questions. The eye of a blood-drunk hunter, one of the key items in the choir's research, is a physical object that embodies the choir's most extreme approach to the problem of Great One contact. The logic seems to be that a hunter who has gone blood-drunk has experienced a kind of perceptual expansion, a dissolution of the barriers between ordinary human cognition and something beyond it, that can be physically captured and used. This is not just philosophically disturbing. It treats other human beings, specifically hunters who have already been devastated by the institution they served, as raw material for further research. The hunters who were sacrificed in this way had already been used up by the hunting program. The choir found a way to extract additional value from what was left of them. The relationship between the choir's research and the beast plague is not simple or linear. The choir did not simply cause the plague through its experiments in the way that the blood clinics caused individual instances of transformation. The choir's relationship with the plague was more complex. It was aware of the plague's nature. It may have studied the transformation process, and it was certainly aware that its own experiments were producing transformations that were in the same general category as plague-induced beasthood. Even if the specific mechanisms differed, the choir treated this awareness as a research input, rather than as a moral problem. By the time of the game, the Upper Cathedral ward has lost most of its human inhabitants in any conventional sense. The space has been taken over by the consequences of the choir's experiments. What was a research facility is now something more like an aftermath. The things that roam its halls are what the research produced, what was left when the researchers themselves were consumed by their own work. The ward is a monument to intellectual ambition that has fully consumed its originators, leaving only the products of that ambition in a space that no longer has anyone to maintain the purpose those products were supposed to serve. The choir's story is the healing church's story in its most condensed and extreme form. A real mission, a genuine desire to achieve contact with something transcendent, pursued with genuine intelligence and real resources, and ultimately consuming the people who pursued it in ways that they did not intend and could not prevent. The choir did not set out to create the things that now inhabit the Upper Cathedral ward. It set out to understand the great ones. The things in the ward are the gap between those two goals made physical. They are what you get when you pursue understanding without adequate attention to what understanding costs. The Upper Cathedral ward also connects to the story of the hunter's nightmare through the shared figure of Ludwig. Ludwig was a church hunter, probably among the most prominent and capable of his generation, who was eventually consumed by beasthood and deposited in the nightmare. His transformation was not simply a failure of the blood safety protocols, it was a product of the church's use of hunters beyond their sustainable limits, of the escalating demands placed on them as the plague intensified, and the church's need for deniable force increased. Ludwig's fate is what the church's hunter program produced when it was fully optimized for church purposes rather than for the well-being of the hunters themselves. The choir kept records, not comprehensive ones, not ones that were designed to be accessible to outsiders, but internal documentation of its research, its methods, its results, and its theoretical frameworks. Some of this documentation survives in the form of item descriptions, in the names given to the things the choir worked with, in the spatial logic of the ward itself. Reading that documentation, such as it is, produces a picture of an institution that was simultaneously extraordinarily sophisticated and extraordinarily indifferent to the human cost of its sophistication. The choir was the best the healing church had to offer intellectually. He was also, in many ways, the worst it had to offer morally. The final legacy of the choir is the state of the upper cathedral ward at the time the player arrives. It is a beautiful ruin, populated by the products of failed experiments, presided over by a great one who may or may not be there willingly, containing the remains of a research program that consumed its practitioners. It is not a monument to failure in the simple sense. The choir achieved things. It made contact with something real. It produced knowledge that was genuine, but the cost of that knowledge was everything that the people who pursued it had been before they started pursuing it, and the knowledge itself is not organized or accessible in any form that anyone who survived can use. The choir's archive is the ward itself, and the archive is now its own warning. Chapter 6. The Night That Never Ended. There are nights in Yharnam, and then there is the night. By the time the player character wakes up on the table in Iosefka's clinic and steps out into the city, the night has been going on for long enough that it has its own logic, its own momentum, its own ecosystem of actors and interests that are no longer simply responding to the plague, but are participating in something that the plague itself is only one dimension of. Understanding the night means understanding not just the beast plague, but the full convergence of everything, the healing church set in motion, arriving simultaneously at a moment that is both catastrophe and, in some possible readings, opportunity. The amygdalae that cling to the city's buildings are visible only to those who have gained sufficient insight, that is, sufficient exposure to the blood and to the knowledge it carries, to perceive them. This detail is enormously important. The Great Ones have been present in Yharnam for a very long time. The Church has known this. The ordinary population has not known this, because the ordinary population did not have the perceptual apparatus to see them, and because the Church, which had that apparatus and had made it available to selected individuals through controlled blood administration, chose not to use that knowledge to inform the public. The amygdalae have been standing at the city's walls and buildings in plain sight for as long as the blood has been flowing, and nobody in a position to change the city's trajectory decided that this was information the public had a right to have. Rom's veil, mentioned earlier in this video, is what prevented ordinary Yharnamites from seeing the amygdalae even with some degree of blood exposure. The veil maintained the illusion that Yharnam was simply a plagued city dealing with a beast problem, rather than what it actually was, which was a point of intersection between human civilization and Great One reality. When the player character kills Rom, the veil drops, and the world of the game changes. The things that had been there all along become visible. The sky turns red. The amygdalae become apparent. The illusion that Yharnam's problem was a manageable plague rather than a fundamental disruption of the boundary between human and Great One, reality collapses entirely. The people who are still alive in Yharnam by the time of the game's night are a sample that tells you something about who survives the collapse of the structures that had previously organized the city. There are a handful of people sheltering in houses, terrified but alive because they had enough common sense to lock their doors and wait. There are a few figures with specific knowledge or specific roles who are navigating the night with more than simple survival in mind. There are the hunters, and there are the people who have been consumed by the plague in various ways, who are now in the streets in forms that range from still recognizable human to completely unrecognizable. The Church's operation during the night is what is left of the institution after the event that triggered this particular cycle. Most of the organized capacity of the Church is gone. The clinics are not operating. The hierarchy is disrupted. The vicar is a beast in the grand cathedral. The choir's ward is an aftermath. What remains are the institutional artifacts, the buildings, the items, the knowledge encoded in the environment, and a handful of people who are still trying to pursue the church's various agendas despite the collapse of the structures that those agendas depended on. Gehrman's function in the hunter's dream during the night is to equip the player character and to encourage them to do what hunters do. His specific instructions and his specific expectations are shaped by his relationship with the moon presence, which is interested in the outcome of this particular night for reasons that are not fully transparent. The dream, as a support structure for the player character's hunting, is not a neutral service. It is part of a system with its own agenda, and Gehrman's role in that system is one he did not choose freely. The insight mechanic in the game, the way that exposure to the true nature of the world gradually changes what the player character can perceive and how the world responds to them, is a mechanical representation of what the healing church's blood was supposed to do, but could not safely achieve. Each increment of insight is a step toward the kind of perception that Byrgenwerth sought through the eye motif, that the choir sought through its experiments, that Willem's whole philosophy was designed to approach safely. The player character, by simply existing through a night in Yharnam, is undergoing the transformation that the church's entire institutional project was meant to engineer deliberately. The night accomplishes through horror what the church tried to accomplish through medicine and research. The great ones that appear during the night are not invaders. They are not coming from somewhere else to attack Yharnam. They have always been there. What has changed is that the structures, including Rom's Veil, including the social structures of the church, that maintained a working fiction about the nature of reality in Yharnam, have broken down sufficiently that the Great One's presence is no longer filtered or mediated. The horror of the night is not the arrival of something new. It is the revelation of what was always already present, what the church's entire apparatus was designed to manage the human encounter with. The hunter's nightmare is accessible during the events of the game's night, and what it contains is a record of what happened to the previous generation of hunters, when the church's demands on them exceeded what they could survive. The nightmare is full of hunters who are still hunting, who cannot stop, who exist in a cycle that has lost its purpose but continues its motion, because the motion is all that remains. This is what the church's hunter program produced at scale. People for whom the hunt replaced every other dimension of their humanity, who then had nowhere to go when the institutional context that gave the hunt its justification dissolved. The figure of Ludwig is central to the nightmare arc and to the question of what the church expected from its hunters and what that expectation cost. Ludwig was, by all indications, genuinely heroic in the conventional sense. Capable, brave, willing to face things that ordinary people could not. The church used those qualities to the point where they were consumed. Ludwig's beasthood in the nightmare is the end point of a process that the church initiated and sustained. The conversion of a person's best qualities into institutional resources, and then the burning of those resources without replacement. By the time the player encounters him, Ludwig has been in the nightmare for so long that his recovery of a fragment of his human consciousness in the game's boss encounter is devastating rather than triumphant. The fishing hamlet and the related secret of the fishing hamlet massacre are part of the night's larger revelation of what the church buried. The hunters who destroyed the fishing hamlet did so to protect the church's access to a specific research material, one that the villagers had been using and that the church wanted control over. The massacre was not incidental or unauthorized. It was an institutional decision, carried out with institutional resources, for institutional purposes. The fishing hamlet is what happens when the church's determination to control access to the things it considered important encountered a community that was using those things independently. Lady Maria's presence in the nightmare is connected to the fishing hamlet. She was among the hunters who participated in the massacre, and her response to what she had done was to seal herself away, to put herself beyond reach of both the church and the ordinary world, in something like a self-imposed punishment. Her existence in the nightmare suggests that the guilt of what she participated in did not leave her, that she chose a form of exile rather than continuing to serve an institution whose actions she could not justify to herself. This is one of the few cases in the game's lore where someone with direct knowledge of the church's worst actions responds to that knowledge with something recognizable as a conscience. The One Reborn, the creature encountered in Yharnam, is a product of the church's ritual practices, taken to an extreme that strains description. It is what happens when the rituals the church used to relate to the Great Ones are pushed past any boundary of scale or control, when the logic of those rituals is applied without the institutional framework that was supposed to keep them bounded. The One Reborn is not a mistake in the sense of an accident. It is an outcome, a destination that the church's ritual tradition was always capable of reaching, given sufficient resources and sufficient disregard for consequences. The school of Mensis and Micolash are related to the night in ways that are partly continuous with the church's history and partly represent a departure from it. Mensis is a splinter group that has taken the church's core questions about Great One contact, about the expansion of human perception, about what lies beyond ordinary consciousness, and pursued them with a recklessness that even the choir, at its most extreme, might have found excessive. Mikolash's existence in the nightmare, chasing and being chased by the thing he sought, is a portrait of intellectual obsession that has consumed the self that was doing the obsessing. The cagehead figures of the school of Mensis, the people who wear large iron cages on their heads, reflect a specific ritual technology that the school developed for inducing a state of expanded perception. The logic is that by confining and restricting the normal perceptual apparatus, you force a different kind of perception to emerge. This is in some ways the exact opposite of Byrgenwerth's approach, which sought to expand the perceptual organs, and in some ways the same thing applied differently. Both approaches are trying to get human cognition into a state where it can engage with Great One reality. The cage-head approach seems to have produced results, specifically the connection to Murgo and the wet nurse, that were more than anyone involved was equipped to handle. Murgo and the wet nurse, encountered in the nightmare of Mensis at the game's apex, are what the knight has been building toward in at least one dimension of the story. Murgo is a Great One's child, an infant whose crying keeps the nightmare active, and whose death, or rather whose silencing, offers a form of resolution to the particular cycle of horror that the knight has become. The wet nurse is the caretaker, an entity of enormous power whose existence is entirely in service of Murgo's survival. Whether killing Murgo, or whatever the player character actually does at the end of that encounter, is a mercy or a tragedy, or simply a necessity, is one of the game's most carefully unresolved questions. The Healing Church's relationship to Murgo, and to the Nightmare of Mensis, is indirect, but real. The conditions that allowed the school of Mensis to reach Murgo were created by decades of church research, and church ritual, and church experimentation. The school of Mensis did not build its project from nothing. It built it on the foundation that the choir had laid, on the knowledge that the church had accumulated, on the understanding of the Great Ones, and the blood that the institution's entire history had produced. Mensis is the church's final intellectual child, the furthest development of the questions that Byrgenwerth had asked, and the church had institutionalized. The night that the player character navigates is, in one reading, the culmination of everything the Healing Church set in motion. The plague, the Great One's visibility, the nightmare, the various factions pursuing their various agendas in the collapse of the church's organizing authority. All of it flows from the founding decision to take the old blood from the chalice dungeons and make it available to the people of Yharnam. The night is not a punishment for that decision. The world of Bloodborne is not structured around punishment and consequence in that moralistic way. The night is simply what the full development of that decision looks like. It is the church's project arrived at its destination. The ending of the game offers the player a choice between remaining in the cycle, taking Gehrman's place as the keeper of the dream, or consuming the umbilical cords and rejecting the Moon Presence's framework entirely. Neither of these outcomes involves the Healing Church in any direct way, because the church, as an institution, is already finished by the time the player character reaches the point where that choice is available. The church's story ends before the game's final chapter. What the game's final chapter is about is what comes after the church, what a human being, or something that was recently a human being, does when the structures that organized reality are gone and only the fundamental questions remain. The night that never ended, or that seemed like it would never end when it began, does end. Whether it ends well depends on what you consider good. But its ending is not separate from the church's story. It is the church's story's final chapter, written by the consequences of everything that came before, and resolved by an individual, the player character, who arrived in Yharnam as a foreign patient seeking healing, and became something that the church, in all its centuries of research and ritual and ambition, never managed to produce. Something that survived the full exposure to what the old blood and the great ones actually were, and came out the other side still capable of making a choice. Chapter 7. Legacies in the Dark. The Healing Church leaves behind a city that is no longer recognizable as the place it was founded to serve. The streets of Yharnam, those cobblestone avenues with their gas lamp lighting and their Gothic architecture, are empty of ordinary human life by the time the night reaches its climax. The people who might have populated them, who once came to the clinics and donated to the collection plates and thanked the healers who treated their sick relatives, are gone. They are dead, or they are beasts, or they are somewhere in between. The church that claimed to serve them outlasted them, in institutional terms, by continuing to exist as a set of buildings and rituals and factions, even after the human community it claimed to serve had been consumed. What the church built, physically, survives. The cathedral is still standing. The architecture of the cathedral ward, those soaring stone facades, and those deep shadow interiors, endures. The chalice dungeons beneath the city endure, as they always have, as they predate the church entirely. The physical mark the church left on Yharnam will outlast the institution and will outlast most of the people who built it. Stone is more durable than intention. Monuments survive the destruction of what they were meant to commemorate. The blood itself endures. This is perhaps the most important legacy. The old blood did not originate with the church and does not end with it. The chalice dungeons still contain their sources. The connection between that blood and the Great Ones still functions. Whatever relationship between human beings and Great One reality the blood mediates is not something that the church created, and is not something that the church's collapse eliminates. The blood was there before the church, and will be there after it, waiting for whoever comes next to find it, and to make the same kinds of choices that Lawrence made, that the choir made, that everyone who has ever engaged seriously with the old blood has made. The knowledge that the church accumulated is distributed across its ruins in a way that makes it neither safely contained nor easily accessible. Item descriptions, environmental arrangements, the architecture of its research facilities, the things that are still alive in the spaces the church used, all of this constitutes a kind of archive that is not organized or indexed or designed to be read. It is an archive that requires someone who is already significantly engaged with the blood and the Great Ones to navigate, which means that the most dangerous knowledge is most accessible to the people who are already in the most danger from it. This is, intentionally or not, a security through obscurity that serves no one well. The hunter tradition's legacy is similarly distributed. There is no functioning workshop in the waking world. There are hunters, scattered and individual, some of whom carry elements of the workshop tradition, without the institutional context that gave that tradition its coherence. The knowledge of how to fight effectively, how to use the trick weapons, how to manage the blood's effects during a hunt, is embodied knowledge that individual hunters carry with them. When they die, which is the occupational norm rather than the exception, that knowledge goes with them, unless they have passed it on. The hunter tradition is one generation away from extinction at any given time, which is a form of institutional fragility that the church, for all its other failures, managed to avoid for centuries. The theological legacy of the healing church, the specific religious framework it built around the old blood and the Great Ones, and the question of human transcendence is an interesting case. The theology was built to serve institutional needs, to provide a sacred framing for the blood ministry and the hunter program, and the research agenda. With the institution collapsed, the theology has no institutional support. But ideas do not require institutional support to persist. The specific combination of ideas that the Church promoted about the blood as sacred, about the great ones as higher beings, about the potential for human beings to transcend their current limitations, these ideas are durable enough that they would survive the institution that produced them. The impact on Yharnam as a city extends beyond the physical and beyond the night of the hunt. The Church shaped Yharnam's social structure, its economy, its culture, its relationship to the outside world, for long enough that those shapes are structural rather than simply political. You cannot simply replace the church with something else and expect the city to function. The city was built around the church in ways that do not naturally accommodate the church's absence. The Yharnam that exists without the healing church is not a healed Yharnam. It is a Yharnam with a void at the center that was the shape of the church. The foreign patients who came to Yharnam and survived the night, which is presumably a small number, carry something of Yharnam back with them when they leave, assuming they can leave. They carry the blood in their systems. They carry knowledge of what happened, or at least a partial perspective on it. They carry whatever insight the night gave them, whatever expansion of perception contact with the great ones and the old blood produced. Whether they can do anything constructive with that cargo in the outside world is not something the game addresses. The game is very much a story of Yharnam and the night, not of what comes after the survivors leave. The Pthumerians' legacy intersects with the church's legacy in the Chalice dungeons, which is still there, still containing their ancient queens, their ritual spaces, their blood sources, their specific version of the encounter between human civilization and Great One reality. The Pthumerians tried to establish a sustainable relationship with the Great Ones, and failed in a slow way that left their ruins intact but their living civilization gone. The Healing Church tried something similar and failed faster and more completely. If anything comes after the Church in the same geographic space, it will have access to both sets of ruins, both sets of failures, as well as whatever survives of the knowledge those failures accumulated. Whether the third attempt would go better than the first two is a question the game does not answer, because it is a question about the future, and the game is very thoroughly about a specific present. The moon presence's role in shaping what happened to Yharnam and to the church is one of the law's more contested areas. The moon presence is a great one that was involved with Gehrman, and through him with the hunter's dream, and through the dream with the entire hunter tradition. Its interest in maintaining the cycle of the hunt, in preventing the kind of transcendence that would allow human beings to genuinely transcend their current relationship with Great One reality, suggests that it had reasons to prefer the situation in Yharnam not to change too rapidly. Whether the moon presence actively shaped the church's development or simply benefited from it is not established. Both readings are available from the evidence. The nightmare of Mensis and the hunter's nightmare both continue to exist as spaces that are accessible from the waking world of Yharnam through specific rituals or transformations. These nightmares are not simply bad memories or symbolic spaces. They are real places where real things are still happening, where hunters who have died are still hunting, where Mikolash is still running, where Murgo is still crying. The church's legacy includes having created the conditions for these spaces to exist and to be accessible, which means that the institutional history of the church extends into dimensions of reality that do not follow the normal rules about past events being finished. Jura, the old hunter who has taken a position on the windmill in Old Yharnam and who shoots at anyone who enters the plague-riddled lower city, represents one specific response to the church's legacy. He has decided that the people who have transformed in Old Yharnam still deserve protection, that they are still people even in their transformed state, and that sending hunters down to kill them is not the same thing as protecting anyone. This position is not popular with the church's remaining partisans, but it is coherent. If the transformation caused by the blood was not the fault of the people who were given the blood, then attacking them for the consequences of that transformation is not justice. Juror's Vigil is uncomfortable in the context of the game's mechanics, because the game wants you to go through Old Yharnam, but it is not incoherent in the context of the game's moral universe. The lasting question that the Healing Church's story poses is not simply what went wrong, but what would have had to be different for it to go less wrong. This is not a question with a clean answer. The old blood was always dangerous. The Great Ones were always present. The gap between human cognitive capacity and the reality that the blood connected human beings to was always vast. The Church did not create those conditions. It inherited them from the Pthumerians and from Byrgenwerth and from the fundamental nature of the world it operated in. What the Church added was scale and institutional self-preservation and the willingness to lie to the people it served in order to protect the mission that was, in some important senses, genuinely worth protecting. A healing church that had been honest about the risks of the blood ministration would have been a smaller institution. It would have had less power, less reach, less ability to accumulate the resources that funded the choir's research and maintained the hunter tradition. It would also have produced fewer of the catastrophes that the actual church produced. Whether a smaller, more honest institution would have found its way to a better outcome is unknowable. What is knowable is that the actual church chose institutional power over honesty at every decision point where the two came into conflict, and that those choices compounded over time into the situation the game presents. The church's founders were not uniquely corrupt or uniquely weak. They were people facing genuinely impossible situations and making choices that seemed reasonable in context. The corruption that developed was not a product of individual villainy, but of institutional pressures that accumulated over time and warped the choices of everyone who operated within them. This is not an exoneration. Institutional pressures do not make individuals blameless for the choices they make within them, but it is an explanation that is more complete and more disturbing than a simple story of evil. What remains of the Healing Church, by the game's night, is less a warning than an archaeology. The warnings were always present, in the chalice dungeons, in Byrgenwerth's example, in the early cases of blood-induced transformation that the Church managed quietly before the plague became impossible to conceal. The warnings were not absent. They were ignored, or managed, or reframed as evidence of the need for more of what was causing the problem. By the time the night arrives, the warnings are over. There is no longer anything to warn. There is only what remains. And what remains is this: a city built for transcendence that achieved it briefly for a very few individuals, at the cost of everything else. A healing program that healed people until it didn't, and then kept going. A hunter tradition that protected people until it didn't, and then kept going. A research program that discovered genuine things about the nature of Great One reality, at a cost that no reasonable accounting would consider acceptable. A theology that gave people a framework for understanding their experience, until the experience outgrew the framework, and the framework broke. The Healing Church is gone. Yharnam is destroyed. The night is ending. And somewhere beneath the city, the old blood is still pooled in those ancient chalice dungeons, thick and dark and patient, waiting with the unconcerned patience of something that does not experience loss the way human beings do. The Church came and went. The blood was there before it, and will be there after. The only question is who comes next, and what they will decide to do with what they find. You said, continue for an additional 8 hours the same way. Continue for an additional 8 hours the same way. 1911 Claude responded. Chapter 8. The Vicar and the Beast Within. Vicar Amelia is one of the most important figures in the Healing Church's story, and she is also one of the most misunderstood, partly because by the time the player encounters her, she is no longer capable of explaining herself. She kneels before the altar of the Grand Cathedral, in a state that is somewhere between prayer and transformation, clutching a gold pendant that she guards with the ferocity of something that has lost everything, except the object it is protecting. She is the highest visible official of the Healing Church, and she is a beast. These two facts exist simultaneously, and the game does not treat the contradiction as ironic so much as it treats it as inevitable. Understanding Amelia requires stepping back from the encounter itself and asking how she got there. The vicar's role within the church was the most visible and the most symbolically important position in the institution's public-facing structure. The vicar was not the most powerful person in the church, in any operational sense. The choir's upper echelons likely held more real influence over the institution's direction by the time Amelia held the position, but the vicar was the face of the church, the figure whose spiritual authority gave the institution its public legitimacy, whose presence in ceremony and whose oversight of doctrine made the healing ministry something more than a blood distribution operation. Amelia herself seems to have been a person of genuine faith within the church's theological framework. This is not a small thing. By the time she reached the vicar's position, she would have known considerably more about the blood and its true nature than ordinary Yharnamites. She would have had access to information about the plague's origins that the public was not given, and yet she continued to serve, continued to lead, continued to embody the church's mission in its most ceremonial and most visible dimension. One possible reading of this is that she was complicit in the church's deceptions. Another is that she believed, with genuine conviction, that the mission was worth the costs and that her own willingness to continue was a form of spiritual courage rather than moral failure. The gold pendant she clings to in the cathedral contains a prayer that is specifically about seeking courage and clarity in the face of darkness, about not losing one's sense of purpose when confronted with things that threaten to overwhelm it. The fact that Amelia is still clutching this object in her beast form, that whatever remains of her consciousness is still oriented toward it, is one of the game's quieter tragedies. She transformed. She lost the form she had. She kept the prayer. Whatever it means to her, it means something. And the game is not cruel enough to make that mean nothing. The question of when Amelia transformed, specifically whether she transformed during the night that the game takes place in, or whether she had already been transformed for some time before the player arrives, is not definitively answered by the lore. The cathedral is not extensively damaged in ways that suggest a recent violent transformation. The environment around her suggests something that has been stable for a while, a beast in a space that has accommodated itself to having a beast, rather than a space that is still processing the shock of a recent change. One reading is that Amelia transformed some time before the game's night begins, that the triggering event for this particular night was not her transformation, but something else, and that she has been in that state long enough for the cathedral's remaining inhabitants to have adjusted accordingly. The church's response to having its vicar transform would have been one of the institution's more delicate challenges. The symbolic weight of the vicar's position was enormous. Acknowledging that the vicar had succumbed to the beast plague would have been catastrophically damaging to the church's public authority, which rested in significant part on the idea that the blood, properly administered and properly received, was safe. A vicar who was a beast was a vicar-shaped refutation of everything the church claimed about itself. The solution the church appears to have adopted was to simply contain the situation. Keep Amelia in the cathedral. Keep the cathedral accessible enough to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Manage information about her condition among the relevant personnel. This is continuous with the church's general approach to the plague, which was always to manage and conceal rather than to acknowledge and address. The vicar, becoming a beast, is a more extreme version of the same problem the church had been managing for decades, and the church applied the same institutional logic it had always applied. What the gold pendant prayer says in the game is specifically a plea for the courage to accept what cannot be changed and the wisdom to know the difference between what must be borne and what must be fought. This framing, even translated into the mechanical text of an item description, is striking in context. Amelia, whether before or during her transformation, was asking for something that the church as an institution never managed to develop: the honesty to look directly at what it had created and respond to that reality rather than to the story it told about itself. The prayer is the individual's resource for what the institution lacked. And even as a beast, she keeps asking. The grand cathedral itself, as a physical space, embodies the contradiction that Amelia represents. It is one of the most beautiful buildings in the game. The architecture is genuinely impressive. The scale is awe-inspiring. The aesthetic is exactly what a cathedral is supposed to be, a space that makes human beings feel small in relation to something vast and sacred. The problem is that the vast and sacred thing the cathedral was built to relate to is not what the congregation was told it was. The cathedral is a beautiful container for a truth that its beauty was designed to make it easier not to examine too closely. The item that Amelia drops when defeated, the gold pendant and its prayer, is significant as a player reward because it is not simply loot in the conventional sense. It is the thing she was holding on to. Receiving it is, in the game's logic, receiving the last thing that connected whatever was left of her human consciousness to the human life she had lived. The player character takes it away, whether this is liberation or simply taking something from a creature that is already destroyed, is another of the game's deliberately unresolved moral questions. Amelia's predecessor vicars, whoever they were, are not named or detailed in the main game's lore. This is a gap that could be read several ways. It might simply reflect the game's general approach of focusing on the present night rather than the institutional history that led to it. It might also reflect a deliberate choice to make Amelia the representative vicar, the one whose story encapsulates what the position meant and what the institution did to the people who held it. Whether she is typical or exceptional among the vicars is something we cannot know, but the logic of the church's development suggests that the pressure on vicars to embody the institution's public mission while knowing its private realities would have been consistent across the position's holders. The theological dimension of Amelia's transformation in the church's own framework is interesting to consider. The church's theology held that the blood connected human beings to something higher. It held that the beast transformation was a danger to be managed and avoided. But within the church's intellectual tradition, particularly in the choir's more advanced research, there were frameworks that suggested the beast transformation was not simply a failure, but a different direction of development, one that did not lead toward Great One contact, but that was not entirely separable from the processes that did. Whether anyone in the church tried to apply that framework to Amelia's situation, to find a meaning in her transformation rather than simply a problem, is not established in the law. What is established is that the Grand Cathedral, even after Amelia has transformed, remains a kind of sacred centre of what is left of Yharnam. People who are still alive in the city treat the cathedral with something like deference, even knowing or suspecting that something has gone wrong within it. This is partly practical. The cathedral is large and defensible, but it is also partly cultural. The deep habituation of treating the cathedral as the city's spiritual centre does not disappear simply because the vicar has become a beast. Institutions persist in the minds of the people they shaped, even after the institutions themselves have collapsed. The broader question that Amelia's story raises is what the church's mission cost the individuals who served it most faithfully, not the cynics, not the opportunists, but the people who genuinely believed in what they were doing, who gave their lives to the institution in the expectation that it would live up to its own ideals. The church failed those people in a specific and personal way, not just in the large systemic way it failed Yharnam's population. It took their faith and made it the engine of something that neither they nor it could control. The most faithful servants of a corrupt institution are not its perpetrators so much as they are its most profound victims. Amelia, holding her prayer in the wreckage of everything she served, is evidence of that. The cathedral ward, in the hours before the player arrives, there is a space that is trying to hold itself together. There are still church servants in the area, some of them hostile, some of them confused, some of them simply continuing to enact their functions because their functions are all they have left. The environment has the quality of an institution in the late stages of collapse, where the forms of normalcy persist after the substance that gave them meaning has gone. This is the church's last public face, the cathedral ward on the night that is ending everything. And it is a face that is holding its shape through pure institutional inertia. Amelia's last act, which is to hold that pendant and say that prayer, is the most human thing in the cathedral ward by the time the player arrives. It is the only act that acknowledges that what is happening is not what was supposed to happen, that reaches back toward a human orientation, even in a form that has lost its humanity. Everything else in the ward is continuation inertia, the church's forms persisting past their content. Only Amelia is doing something that looks like reckoning, and she is doing it in the form of a beast, which is the form the church gave her. The Healing Church built a beautiful cathedral and put its highest official in it, and told the city that what happened in that cathedral was sacred and safe and beneficial. By the time the player walks through its doors, the highest official is a beast, and the sacred is indistinguishable from the catastrophe. The cathedral is still beautiful. The architecture has not changed. What has changed is what it contains, and the contrast between the beauty of the container and the nature of what is contained is as precise a statement of the church's overall story as anything else in the game. The form persisted, the content transformed, and neither the form nor the content knows what to do about that. The prayer itself, the specific words of it, points towards something that the church never managed to institutionalize, the acceptance of limits. The prayer asks for courage, not for power. It asks for clarity, not for knowledge. It asks for the ability to bear what must be borne, not for the ability to overcome it. These are not the virtues of an institution that spent centuries telling itself and everyone around it that the blood could give human beings access to something beyond their ordinary limits. They are the virtues of someone who has encountered those limits personally and is trying to find a way to face them honestly. Amelia found that orientation. The institution she led never did. Closing the chapter on Vicar Amelia means acknowledging that she is both the church's failure and its most honest representative. She failed in the sense that she transformed, that she became the thing the church was supposed to prevent. She is honest in the sense that her transformation is visible, undeniable, present in the church's most sacred space in a form that cannot be reframed or explained away. The church spent its entire history hiding the consequences of the blood. In its last vicar, those consequences are fully visible. The hiding is over. What the blood does is right there, in the cathedral, holding a prayer, still kneeling. Chapter 9. Cainhurst and the Vile Blood. Cainhurst Castle stands apart from Yharnam in almost every sense. It is physically distant, accessible only by a specific ritual involving an invitation that the church does not distribute. It is architecturally different, an older style, colder, more austere in the specific way of very old aristocratic buildings that were built to impress rather than to welcome. And it is philosophically distant, representing a relationship with the blood that the Healing Church declared heretical and then tried to eradicate. Understanding Cainhurst means understanding the church, not through the church's own self-presentation, but through the existence of something the church tried to destroy. The Vile Bloods are the inhabitants and practitioners of Cainhurst, an aristocratic lineage that developed its own relationship with the blood independently of the Healing Church. The Cainhurst blood is described as impure by the church, as corrupt, as something fundamentally different from and worse than the old blood that the church worked with. The game allows you to decide how much of this characterization to accept. The church has obvious institutional reasons to declare competitor blood supplies impure. Whether the vile blood is actually more dangerous or more corrupting than the church's own old blood is not something the game establishes with the clarity the church would like. The Cainhurst lineage predates the Healing Church's dominance in the region, and this is important context. The nobles of Cainhurst had their own relationship with the blood, their own understanding of it, their own uses for it, before Lawrence and the church established themselves as the region's authoritative blood institution. The church's declaration that vile blood was impure was not an objective assessment made from a position of neutral authority. It was a territorial claim made by an institution that wanted to be the only legitimate source of blood-related power in its sphere of influence. Queen Annalise is the figure at the centre of Cainhurst, the ruler of the vile blood lineage, and she is still there when the player arrives, still seated on her throne, preserved by the vile blood, in a state that is not quite life and not quite death, but is substantially more coherent than most things the player encounters. She is, in the game's optional content, someone the player character can choose to serve, to become a vile blood themselves, which is presented as a genuine alternative to the church-affiliated hunter tradition, rather than as an obviously worse option. Annalise's offer to the player character is interesting in the context of everything the game has established about the Church. She is not offering healing. She is not offering transcendence in any of the specific senses the Church pursued. She is offering continuity, membership in a lineage, a relationship with the blood that is about inheritance and identity rather than about the specific transformative or therapeutic purposes the Church emphasized. The vile blood framework for the blood is a different framework, not obviously worse, and in at least one dimension, more honest. Annalise does not claim the blood will save anyone or elevate anyone. She claims it binds people together in something durable. The massacre of Canehurst by the executioners was an institutional act of violence that the Church carried out with full deliberation. Ligarius led the executioners there. They killed the castle's inhabitants, and Ligarius remained behind to seal something, specifically the Queen, who had survived. The survival of Annalise, despite the massacre, suggests that she was not simply a noble with unusual longevity, but something that the blood had made genuinely difficult to destroy. Whether the executioners knew she survived is not clear. Whether Ligarius knew and chose his self-imposed exile, partly as a continuing containment of her as one reading of his presence at the castle's peak. Ligarius's armor and his weapons, the items associated with him, tell a story of a man who was deeply committed to the Church's theological framework and who had convinced himself that what he was doing at Canehurst was holy work. The massacre of a noble lineage is not a comfortable thing to carry, even for someone who believes the lineage was corrupt. Ligarius's choice to remain, to become a permanent guardian of the castle, against anyone who might come looking for what was inside, suggests that the work did not resolve cleanly for him. He had accomplished his mission. He had not found peace in the accomplishment. The vile bloods that the player can encounter in the optional Chalice dungeon content, and through the multiplayer Covenant mechanics, are not straightforwardly villains. They are people, or people-adjacent entities, who have made a specific choice about their relationship with the blood, and who exist outside the Church's institutional framework as a result of that choice. The Church's characterization of them as corrupt and dangerous reflects the Church's need to have an enemy that justifies the existence of the executioners and the violence of the Canehurst massacre. Whether that characterization accurately reflects the vile blood's actual nature is a different question. The specific nature of the vile blood and why the Church considered it impure is not entirely clear from the lore. One reading is that the vile blood comes from a source connected to a different great one than the old blood in the Chalice dungeons, and that the Church's theological framework, which had specific ideas about which great ones were relevant and which were not, categorized that source as lesser or corrupt. Another reading is that the vile blood produced different effects in those who used it, effects that the Church found threatening rather than simply dangerous, effects that might have undermined the specific relationship between blood use and Church authority that the institution depended on. The architectural details of Canehurst Castle suggest a civilization that had its own sophisticated relationship with the blood long before the Church's influence reached it. The castle is full of evidence of a specific aesthetic and intellectual tradition, one that is older than the Church and in some ways more coherent, in the sense of having developed on its own terms, rather than having been assembled from Byrgenwerth's research agenda, and the practical requirements of a mass healing ministry. Canehurst was doing something with the blood. What it was doing was different from what the Church was doing. Whether different means worse is precisely what the Church wants you to assume and what the evidence does not necessarily support. The optional nature of the Canehurst content in the game is itself meaningful in the context of the Church's legacy. To reach Canehurst, you need an invitation that the Church did not leave lying around in obvious places. You need to know where to look and how to use what you find. This gatekeeping mirrors the Church's own information control, except that in this case, the information being controlled is the existence of an alternative to the Church's framework. Canehurst is accessible to those who know to look for it, which was probably always the case in the game's world as well. The Church's massacre did not eradicate the knowledge of Canehurst. It suppressed it, pushed it to the margins, made it something you had to seek out rather than something encountered in the normal course of life in Yharnam. Alfred's obsession with destroying Annalise, his decision to pursue her even during the catastrophic events of the night, tells you something important about how completely the church's framing of the vile blood had consumed him. The city is being destroyed. The church's institutional structure has collapsed. The plague is consuming Yharnam. And Alfred's response to all of this is to track down and destroy the surviving vile blood queen, as though completing this mission will mean something in the context of the ongoing catastrophe. His commitment to the mission has survived every other form of context that might have given it meaning. What is left is the mission itself, stripped of purpose, continued because stopping it would require him to acknowledge that it was never going to solve the problem it was supposed to solve. The vile blood covenant, in game mechanic terms, represents the possibility of a different relationship with the events of the night. Not a better relationship, not necessarily a worse one, but a different orientation that is not organized around the church's framework of what matters and why. This is consistent with what Cainhurst represents in the law. It is an alternative. It did not win. Historically, the church's power was sufficient to nearly destroy it, but it survived, specifically because Annalise survived, and in surviving it maintained the possibility that the church's version of the blood story is not the only version. The gold of Cainhurst, the aesthetic of pale marble and cold grandeur, and the specific aristocratic hauteur that the castle's design communicates, is different enough from Yharnam's ecclesiastical Gothic that the contrast is immediately legible when you arrive there. This is not the church's aesthetic. This predates the church. The people who built Cainhurst had a different set of values, a different self-understanding, a different relationship with the blood, and with whatever higher realities the blood connected them to. Whether those values were better or worse than the church's is genuinely ambiguous. But the fact that they existed, that a different framework for the blood existed within the same geographical and historical context as the church, is significant. The vile blood's relationship with death, specifically with a kind of death that the blood makes reversible, or at least extremely slow, is different from the church's relationship with transformation and healing. The church treated death as the thing the blood was supposed to prevent. The vile bloods seem to have developed a relationship with the blood that made death a different kind of threshold, less absolute, more permeable. This is not obviously worse than the church's approach. The beast transformation, which is the church's version of blood gone wrong, is arguably a worse outcome than the kind of deathlessness that characterizes Annalise. Whether the vile blood's version of that permeability of death would scale differently, whether a whole city of vile bloods would have produced the same kinds of catastrophes that a whole city of church blood recipients produced, is a counterfactual the game does not explore. The Cainhurst story ultimately serves as a mirror for the healing church's story, a comparison that reveals the church's choices as choices rather than as necessities. The church chose to be a mass institution. It chose to distribute the blood widely. It chose to manage the consequences through secrecy and institutional violence. Cainhurst remained small, aristocratic, selective, and while it was nearly destroyed by the church's institutional violence, it was not destroyed by its own blood practices in the way that Yharnam was. The scale of the church's operations was a choice that had consequences. Cainhurst's smaller scale was also a choice, and it had different consequences. The question of what the vile blood actually is, at a biological or cosmological level, is one that the game leaves productively ambiguous. It is blood that the church called impure. The church's opinions on blood are not value-neutral assessments. The vile blood produces a different set of effects than the church's old blood. Different does not mean worse. Annalise, who has been using the vile blood for long enough to be indefinitely preserved, is not obviously more diminished or more transformed in negative ways than the church's own vicars, one of whom became a beast. The evidence available does not support the church's characterization. It supports a more complicated picture, in which there were multiple relationships with the blood possible in this world, and the church's was the one that happened to have the most institutional power. The end of the Cainhurst chapter of this story is, appropriately, not an ending. Annalise survives. She can be killed by Alfred, but even then, she can be resurrected in the game mechanics, which is a form of law consistency about what the vile blood has done to her. She is not easily finished. The church tried to finish Canehurst and did not quite succeed. The Night of the Hunt tried to finish Canehurst simply by consuming the context that gave the conflict meaning, and did not quite succeed either. Canehurst persists, cold and isolated, with its queen on her throne, its vile blood scattered but not gone, its alternative to the church's blood narrative intact in the castle's stones and in whatever Annalise still carries with her. The church's war against the vile blood was one of its defining projects. The vile blood survived the church. In the long accounting, that is a specific kind of verdict. Chapter 10. Gehrman's Vigil. There is a figure who appears early in the game and who is easy to misread on first encounter. He is old. He is in a wheelchair. He is in a dream space that initially seems like a safe harbour in the middle of the night's chaos. And he is warm toward the player character in a way that very few things in Bloodborne are warm toward anything. He gives advice. He provides access to weapons and upgrades. He seems, in the early game, like the helpful mentor figure that the genre convention leads you to expect. Gehrman is not that, or he is that, and considerably more, and understanding what he is, beyond the surface reading, is one of the game's most important lore tasks. Gehrman was a hunter. He was, by all accounts, an exceptional one, someone who excelled at the work not just technically, but in the sense of having a genuine vocation for it, a feeling that this was what he was supposed to be doing. The workshop he established, the training he provided, the tradition he built were real achievements that benefited real people over real generations. His investment in the hunter's craft was not simply professional, it was personal in a way that made the loss of the workshop and the events that led to that loss devastating in a specifically personal dimension. The doll in the hunter's dream is the central artifact of Gehrman's inner life, and approaching it carefully reveals things about him that no direct exposition could communicate as effectively. She is a simulacrum of a real person, Maria, who was a hunter, and who was important to Gehrman in a way that is not spelled out, but is clear in the specific care that went into her creation. Gehrman made the doll, or had her made, because the real person was gone, and having something that occupied the same space in his environment, that moved through the dream in roughly the way the person had moved through his actual life, was better than nothing. This is a profoundly human response to loss. It is also, in the context of the hunter's dream and the moon presence's purposes, something that the larger forces shaping that dream space have incorporated into their own agenda. The moon presence's relationship with Gehrman is the most important structural fact about the hunter's dream. Gehrman did not choose to be the keeper of the dream. He was bound to it, at some point in the history between the founding of the workshop and the events of the game, by the moon presence in a way that he could not subsequently escape. The dream is not Gehrman's creation. It is the moon presence's instrument, and Gehrman is the moon presence's servant within it, whether he fully understands that or not, whether he endorses it or not. What the moon presence wants from the dream, and specifically from Gehrman's service within it, seems to involve the cycling of hunters through the night in ways that prevent any individual hunter from achieving the kind of transcendence that would take them beyond the moon presence's reach. Gehrman's role is to equip hunters to support them through the night, and to offer them release at the end, specifically a death at his hands that returns them to the cycle without having broken through to whatever lies beyond the moon presence's framework. He does this not because he wants to trap anyone, but because it is the only thing his situation permits him to do. The specific grief that Gehrman carries is visible in his dialogue, in the way he speaks about the hunt and about the people who participate in it, in the specific sadness he shows when the player character progresses in ways that he recognizes as leading toward the night's culmination. He has seen this before. He has seen hunters wake up in the dream, do the work of the night, come back changed, and eventually reach the point where the only option he can offer is the option he has always offered. He has been watching this cycle for longer than any human being should be asked to watch anything. The warmth he shows toward the player character at the beginning is genuine, and it is also the warmth of someone who knows how this ends, and is sad about it before it has happened. His offer at the end, to put the player character to sleep, to give them a peaceful death that will release them from the hunt, is not a villain's offer, It is the offer of someone who genuinely cannot imagine a better outcome. From inside Gehrman's framework, from within the limits of what the moon presence is binding on him, allows him to see death at his hands is the best thing that can happen to a hunter who has reached the end of the night. The dream does not offer anything beyond that. He is offering the best he has. It is not enough, and he probably knows it, which is part of what makes the encounter devastating, rather than simply threatening. Lady Maria, the real person whom the doll was made to resemble, was a hunter of significant skill, and the one who eventually sealed herself in the astral clock tower. Her relationship with Gehrman was not a simple one. There is something like a mentor-student relationship implied, but the specific nature of her importance to him goes beyond that. She was someone whose presence in his life meant something that her absence continued to mean long after she was gone. The doll is evidence of that. A person who was simply a respected colleague does not inspire the creation of a simulacrum. Someone who occupied a specific and irreplaceable space in your inner life does. Maria's own story, her participation in the fishing hamlet massacre, her self-imposed exile to the clock tower, is a story about what the church's demands cost the hunters who served it most effectively. She was not a bad person. She was a person who did something she could not subsequently justify to herself, something the church told her was necessary, and that she concluded, afterward, was not. Her response was not to continue serving and compartmentalizing, the way many hunters did. It was to remove herself from the situation entirely, to choose a form of punishment that was also a form of protest. She knew what she had done, and she chose not to do anything more. Gehrman's vigil in the dream is a form of punishment too, though not one he chose. He is bound to a service he did not ask for, in a space that is comfortable but not free, tending to hunters who pass through and mostly do not return, holding the memory of a person who is gone, in the form of a simulacrum that moves but does not speak in the way the original spoke. This is the life of someone who has been incorporated into a system that uses them without regard for what they need or want, which is a description that applies equally well to the healing church's treatment of its hunters, its research subjects, and its city. Gehrman is the hunter tradition's victim, in the same way that Yharnam's population is the church's victim. He was used up and left in place. The hunter's dream, as a physical space, reflects Gehrman's inner state in ways that are probably not accidental. It is beautiful, in the specific way of something that has been very carefully maintained over a very long time. The workshop within it is orderly. The graves that appear as the player progresses through the game, the graves of hunters who have passed through the dream, are tended. Everything in the space has the quality of something that someone cares about deeply, that someone has put sustained attention into, that someone has refused to let become disordered, even when disorder might have been more honest about the situation. Gehrman has kept the dream. He has kept it the way you keep a space, when keeping it is the only agency you have left. The plain doll, for her part, occupies a strange and important position in the dream's ecosystem. She is not Gehrman's creation in any emotional sense, even if he initiated her making. She has her own relationship with the player character that is distinct from and in some ways more genuine than the relationship Gehrman offers. She does not have an agenda. She does not have a role imposed on her by the moon presence in the way that Gehrman does. She simply exists in the dream, and within that existence, she responds to the player character with a kind of uncomplicated care that is genuinely rare in the game. Whether she is conscious in any meaningful sense is one of the game's deliberately unanswered questions, but the quality of her responsiveness suggests something that is at least functionally indistinguishable from genuine feeling. Gehrman's combat style, which you encounter if you choose not to accept his offer at the end of the game, is revealing. He fights the way someone fights who has been doing this for a very long time, with the efficiency and the sadness of someone for whom this is not exciting. He has probably killed hunters in this way before, not frequently, but it has happened. Hunters who refused the offer, who chose to fight rather than to sleep. He is not angry that the player character refuses. He is sad. The fight is not a punishment. It is the only other option the dream's logic permits. He fights to the best of his ability, and if you beat him, he is released. The moon presence descends, and the player character faces something that Gehrman could not have prepared them for because he was never allowed to acknowledge it existed. The ending, where you accept Gehrman's offer, is the ending where you take his place. The player character sleeps. Gehrman is free, and whoever comes next will find someone new waiting in the dream to equip them and support them, and eventually offer them the same release. Whether the player character in this ending is aware of what they have agreed to is not clear. Whether they would have agreed if they had fully understood what the dream's keeper position entailed is a different kind of question. The dream looks like a safe haven. It is a cage with a comfortable interior. The difference between those two things is something Gehrman has had a very long time to understand. His release, in the ending where you fight him, is the most explicitly emotional beat in the game's final section. He thanks you. He has been waiting for this, in some dimension of his experience, for longer than you can measure. The gratitude is real, and then the moon presence arrives, because the position of Dreamkeeper cannot simply be left empty. Someone has to hold it. The system requires a keeper. The system gets one. Whether you then fight the moon presence or become its new Gehrman is the game's deepest choice, and it is a choice that the game is wise enough not to moralize about too directly. Gehrman's Vigil is the Healing Church's hunter tradition in its final, most personal form. Everything that the Church did with hunters, every way it used them and burned through them, and failed to protect them from what the hunt required, culminates in this one old man in a wheelchair, in a beautiful dream that is also a prison, tending to the memory of someone who is gone, offering release to people who mostly do not understand what they are being offered. He is not the Church's villain. He is the Church's last hunter, the one who has been keeping at it the longest, the one the system never let go. He deserves better than what he got. In the endings where the player can give him something like that, the game earns its place among the most emotionally intelligent pieces of lore building in the genre. Chapter 11. The Great Ones and the Human Threshold. The Great Ones are not gods in any conventional sense, and understanding what they actually are, as best the lore allows us to understand it, is essential for understanding everything the Healing Church was doing, and why it ultimately could not succeed on its own terms. The Church built an entire theology around the Great Ones, an entire research agenda, an entire institutional structure, without ever fully reckoning with the fundamental nature of the things at the center of that theology. This is not because the Church lacked intelligence or resources. It is because the Great Ones are genuinely difficult to understand in terms that human cognition is equipped to handle. The Great Ones are entities that exist on a scale of being that human beings are not naturally calibrated to perceive or comprehend. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal fact within the game's cosmology. Ordinary human beings cannot see the amygdalae that cling to Yharnam's buildings. They cannot perceive the aspects of the world that Great One reality makes available. This is not because those things are hidden in any conventional sense. It is because the human perceptual apparatus is not by default configured to process that register of reality. The old blood changes the configuration. Insight changes the configuration. Both of these changes come with costs that make the configuration change difficult to recommend unreservedly. The specific Great Ones named and encountered in the game each represent a different aspect of what Great One existence involves. Eden, the formless Great One, is encountered only through its effects and its adherents, never directly. It is a being without physical form, existing as sound and concept, whose presence is felt rather than seen. The adherents of Eden, Ariana, and the chapel dweller among them have a relationship with something that cannot be directly perceived, which is perhaps the most honest version of the relationship the Church claimed to offer through its blood ministry, but never actually delivered. The Healing Church promised access to higher reality. Eden's adherents seem to have some form of genuine connection to something real, even if they cannot fully articulate what that something is. Ebrietas has already been discussed in the context of the choir's experiments, but her cosmological significance deserves more attention. She is described as a great one who was left behind, which implies the existence of some event or process by which other great ones departed from whatever relationship they had with the human world. What that departure event was, when it happened, and why Ebrietas did not participate in it, are questions the law raises without definitively answering. One reading is that she remained by choice, that something about the human world, or about the church's project specifically, gave her a reason to stay. Another reading is that she was unable to leave for reasons that have nothing to do with choice. The distinction matters cosmologically, but cannot be resolved from the available evidence. Murgo is a great one's infant, which is a category that the game introduces without fully explaining the implications of. The great ones, in the lore, are described as unable to produce their own offspring and as seeking to use human beings to resolve this inability. This dynamic, the great ones seeking human beings as vehicles for reproduction, complicates the church's theological framework enormously. If the great ones need something from human beings, their relationship to human beings is not the relationship of higher beings to lesser ones. It is the relationship of entities with a specific dependency to entities who might be able to meet it. The church built its entire theology on the assumption that the great ones were purely superior. The reproductive dependency suggests a more complicated picture. The moon presence's interest in the hunter cycle, in maintaining the cycle of hunts and preventing any individual hunter from achieving genuine transcendence, is connected to this reproductive dynamic in ways that are not entirely clear. One reading is that the moon presence benefits from human beings who are perpetually in a state of managed engagement with Great One reality without ever fully crossing the threshold into Great One existence. These human beings are useful to it in ways they cannot fully understand, which is consistent with the general pattern of Great One human relationships in the game. Another reading is that the moon presence fears what happens if a human being achieves genuine ascension, because such an ascension would represent something the Great Ones cannot control. The Orphan of Kos is perhaps the most emotionally resonant Great One encounter in the game, specifically because its origin connects directly to the Healing Church's worst act. Kos, the Great One, was found by the Byrgenwerth scholars and the early church hunters, dead or in some ambiguous state, in the fishing hamlet. What was done to her body, the harvesting of whatever she contained, was the act that the Hamlet massacre was designed to conceal. The orphan is the product of Kos, and whatever she carried, born into a world that had already been drained of the mother that produced it, screaming its way into an existence that is defined by loss before it begins. The violence that the church performed in the fishing hamlet did not disappear into silence. It produced something that is still screaming about it in the nightmare. Cosm, the amygdalae, the wet nurse, the various entities associated with Great One reality that the player encounters throughout the game, each carry information about what Great One existence is like from the inside, or what it looks like from a perspective that is closer to Great One reality than human ordinary experience allows. None of this information is comfortable. None of it suggests that proximity to Great One reality is a net positive for any individual or community that seeks it. The church promised that the blood was a path towards something better. The Great Ones encountered at the end of that path do not suggest that better is the right word. The insight mechanic, as the player accumulates more of it, changes the game world in ways that are directly relevant to understanding the Great One's relationship with the human world. More insight makes certain previously invisible things visible. It makes the amygdalae apparent. It makes the gameplay itself slightly more difficult, because more perception means more exposure to things that are genuinely disturbing to perceive. This is the game's mechanical representation of a truth that the Healing Church knew but could not communicate to the people it ministered to. More access to Great One reality is not unambiguously beneficial. It is true access, and truth, in this context, comes with costs. The Great Ones, that appear specifically during the night, summoned or made accessible by the particular conditions of this culminating event, are not simply enemies in the mechanical sense. They are presences whose existence in the accessible world is itself evidence of how far the situation has progressed. Their appearance in Yharnam's streets and buildings is not a separate catastrophe from the Beast Plague. It is the same event at a different scale of visibility. The plague was always a symptom of the proximity between human civilization and Great One reality that the Church's blood ministry created. The Great Ones, appearing in the streets, is the same proximity made visible in a different form. The Pthumerian's own experience with the Great Ones, which we access through the Chalice dungeons, provides a longer baseline for thinking about what Great One contact produces over generations. The Pthumerian civilization developed specific ritual technologies for managing the relationship with the Great Ones, maintained their queens in a state of preserved life, specifically because those queens served a function in the ongoing ritual relationship, and ultimately did not survive as a living civilization despite or because of this management. The Church, which came along millennia later, had access to the Pthumerian ruins as evidence of what this kind of relationship produces over time. The ruins said, "This is what you end up with." The Church read them as, "This is what we can do better." The question of what the Great Ones actually want is one that the game deliberately leaves unanswerable in simple terms. They seem to want connection in some form with human beings. They seem to want offspring. They seem to want witnesses, beings capable of perceiving them and the reality they inhabit. They seem, in at least some cases, to want something like understanding, a relationship with human consciousness that goes beyond the purely instrumental. Whether these wants are compatible with human well-being, whether a world that successfully met Great One needs would be a world that any human being would find livable, is a question that the game does not answer in any reassuring way. The threshold between human existence and Great One existence is where the Church spent its entire institutional life, without ever successfully navigating it. The hunters lived in proximity to that threshold, dealing with the consequences of people who had crossed it involuntarily through the beast transformation. The choir tried to engineer voluntary crossing, with results that were not what they hoped. The moon presence specifically maintained something at the threshold, a cycle that kept human beings engaged with the threshold without crossing it in ways the moon presence could not manage. The player character, at the end of the game's main arc, is someone who has spent an entire night in proximity to that threshold and who must now choose what to do about it. The Great Ones are not the Church's gods in the sense of being beings that care about the Church's existence or purposes. They are entities that the Church found and built itself around. The relationship between the Church and the Great Ones was always more like the relationship between a civilization and a geological feature than like the relationship between a worshipper and a deity. The geological feature does not know the civilization is there. It does not respond to the civilization's rituals or care about the civilization's theology. It simply is what it is, and the civilization must decide how to live with what it is. The Healing Church tried to live with the Great Ones by building a religion around them. The Great Ones were not particularly affected by this. The Church was the human threshold, the boundary between what human beings are by default and what the blood and the Great Ones make possible, is ultimately what the entire Bloodborne story is about. The Healing Church was an institution that existed at that threshold and tried to manage it for a community that mostly did not know the threshold existed. The night is what happens when the management fails, when the threshold becomes too present to manage, when the things on the other side of it are no longer willing to stay there. What lies beyond the threshold, for the player character who chooses to fight the moon presence and consume the umbilical cords, is something that no institution, not the Church, not Byrgenwerth, not Mensis, had the framework to imagine. An infant, vast and formless, something that was a human being and is now something else. Whether that is better is a question the game ends before answering. Chapter 12, What the Blood Remembers. The old blood is not simply a biological substance. Within the logic of the game, within the lore that has accumulated around it through centuries of Pthumerian ritual and Byrgenwerth research and Healing Church ministry and choir experimentation, it is something more like a record. It carries information. It carries connections. It carries something of what everything that has touched it has left behind, and that accumulation of contact has given it properties that no simple healing substance would have. Understanding the blood as a record, as a kind of living archive, helps explain both why it works the way it works, and why it cannot be safely used at the scale the Healing Church tried to use it. The Pthumerian queens in the Chalice dungeons are not simply preserved, they are sources. The blood that the Church drew from the dungeons carried something of them, something of their long relationship with the Great Ones, something of the ritual history that the Chalice dungeons represented. When the Church refined the blood for ministry use, it was not simply filtering out dangerous components and retaining therapeutic ones. It was working with a substance that had a history it could not entirely edit. Whatever the Pthumerians had done to create that blood's properties, those properties were part of what the blood carried, regardless of what the Church wanted it to carry. The beast's transformation in this reading is the blood remembering something. Specifically, it is the blood's accumulated record of what contact with Great One reality does to human biology when that contact exceeds what the human body was designed to handle. The transformation is not a failure of the refining process, so much as it is the blood's own logic asserting itself against the Church's attempt to make it something more limited than it actually was. The Church wanted a healing substance. The blood was a connection to something vast. The transformation is what happens when you try to use a connection as a tool, and the thing at the other end of the connection responds to the contact. The specific forms that beast's transformation takes are not random. The game's various beast types, the cleric beasts, the simple beasts, the more complex transformations encountered in the dungeons and the nightmare reflect different histories of exposure and different starting points. A cleric who transforms through extended ritual use of the blood produces a different kind of beast than a laborer who is exposed through a clinic. The transformation is shaped by what was there before it, by the specific human identity and history that the blood worked with. What remains after transformation is not simply the beast, but the beast plus what that person was. And the interaction between those two things produces the variety of forms the game presents. The blood's memory also explains the specific quality of the blood healing mechanic in the game. When the player character uses blood vials to heal during combat, they are using the blood's record of vitality, of health, of biological integrity to override the current damaged state of their body. This is not simply a tonic or a bandage. It is a reference to a prior state, a recall of what the body was before it was damaged. The blood knows what health looks like. It applies that knowledge. This is profoundly useful in the short term and profoundly dangerous in the long term, because extended use means extended exposure to the blood's full record, not just the parts the Church selected for therapeutic emphasis. The chalice ritual blood that appears as an item in the dungeon content is a more concentrated version of what the Church worked with, less refined, closer to the source. Using it in the chalice dungeons accesses something that is more directly the blood's full record, rather than the curated version the Church prepared for public ministry. The differences in what you encounter in the dungeons compared to what you encounter in the main game are, in part, a reflection of this difference in blood concentration. The dungeons show you what the blood is without the Church's editorializing. The ritual use of blood in the Church's ceremonies was attempting to do something specific with this memorial quality. The Church's rituals were not simply symbolic. They were, at least in intention, attempts to access the blood's record in controlled ways, to use the blood's memory of what higher reality looks like as a navigational tool for the community's relationship with the Great Ones. The ceremony of blood ministration in a church clinic was a pale, practical version of this. The choir's rituals were a much more direct attempt to use the blood's memorial quality to establish actual contact with Great One reality, rather than simply a therapeutic relationship with its effects. The hunter's mark, the brand that hunters carry and that allows them to draw on the power of the dream, is a specific use of the blood's memorial quality. It is a mark that the blood recognizes, that tells the blood's record that this body is associated with a specific lineage and a specific function. The dream responds to the mark not because the dream is mystical in a vague sense, but because the blood carries the record of what hunters are, and the dream is structured around that record. Gehrman in the dream is the living embodiment of what the hunter tradition's blood record looks like after a very long time. He is what the mark leads toward, in some sense. He is what the blood remembers when it remembers hunting. The relationship between the blood and memory extends to the specific way NPCs in the game relate to their own histories. Many of the characters who are most deeply involved with the blood, who have been using it the longest, or in the most concentrated forms, have a specific quality of loss around their personal histories. They remember what they were before in ways that are more painful than ordinary nostalgia, because the blood makes the before and the after both unusually vivid. Gehrman's grief, Jura's withdrawal, Simon's careful management of his own blood use. All of these reflect characters who are in a specific relationship with the blood's memorial quality, who are carrying the before more heavily because the blood makes carrying it unavoidable. The specific moment in the game where the player character consumes 3 chords of the umbilical cord is a literal ingestion of something that carries Great One memory, that records what it means to have a connection to a Great One, so intimate that the distinction between Great One and not Great One becomes blurred. The chords carry memories of what that intimacy felt like, what it produced, what it cost. Consuming them is not simply a power upgrade in any conventional sense. It is the incorporation of a specific kind of memory into the player character's own blood record. After that incorporation, the player character's blood remembers things that no ordinary human blood remembers. This is what makes the confrontation with the moon presence possible. Not the power it grants, but the memory it includes. The blood's relationship with the past is also relevant to understanding why the Chalice dungeons feel so different from the main game's surface world. The dungeons are saturated with old blood, with Pthumerian blood that carries the full weight of that civilization's long relationship with the Great Ones. Walking through the dungeons is walking through a blood record that is considerably older and considerably more comprehensive than anything on the surface. The things that live in the dungeons, the enemies and the bosses and the specific atmosphere of the spaces, reflect this density of old memory. They are not simply monsters. They are what happens when a space is soaked in the blood's memory for long enough that the memory becomes the environment. The living failures in the lecture building are one of the game's more explicit statements about what happens when the blood's memorial quality is engaged without adequate preparation. These are Byrgenwerth students who were exposed to something that expanded their connection to the blood's record beyond what they could sustain. They are alive, in some sense, but they are no longer navigating that aliveness in any coherent way. They have accessed the blood's memory too fully, have found themselves in a record that they cannot find their way out of. They are not beasts. They are something else, something that the beast, transformation, and the standard healing failure both fail to describe. They are people who have become lost in what the blood remembers. The Healing Church's whole project, understood in this framework, was an attempt to use the blood's memorial quality therapeutically to draw on the blood's record of vitality and health and connection to higher reality in ways that would benefit the people who received it, without exposing those people to the parts of the record that were dangerous. This is a coherent project. It is not an obviously foolish one. The problem is that the blood's record cannot be selectively accessed in the way the Church needed it to be. You cannot take out the parts you want and leave the rest. The blood comes as a whole, as a record that includes everything it has ever carried, and the attempt to use part of it inevitably involves exposure to all of it. The old blood remembers everything. It remembers the Pthumerians. It remembers the Great Ones. It remembers every person who has ever been transfused with it, and every transformation that transfusion has produced. It remembers the Chalice dungeons and what happened in them over millennia. It remembers Byrgenwerth's experiments and the Church's ministry and the choir's rituals. It carries all of that forward in every vial, in every clinic, in every ceremony. When the Healing Church administered blood to an ordinary Yharnamite seeking healing for a mundane ailment, it was giving them access to that entire record. The therapeutic effect was real, so was everything else that came with it. And the Church, which knew what the blood carried, chose not to tell the people receiving it what they were actually ingesting. That choice, the choice to withhold the full record from the people most exposed to it, is perhaps the Healing Church's most fundamental betrayal of the people it claimed to serve. Chapter 13. The Architecture of Deception The healing church did not simply lie to the people of Yharnam. It built a system in which lying was the default mode of operation, in which the structures of the institution were designed to ensure that the truth of what the church was doing would not easily surface into the consciousness of anyone who might act on it. Understanding the specific architecture of that deception is important, not just for understanding the church, but for understanding how institutions that do harmful things at scale managed to do so for as long as the church did. The tiered information structure of the church has been mentioned in earlier chapters of this video, but it deserves more specific attention as a designed system rather than a simple hierarchy. The church did not simply have some people who knew more and some who knew less. It had a structured system of compartmentalized knowledge in which different levels of the institution had access to different sets of facts, and in which the institutional structures actively prevented the synthesis of those facts into a picture that any single person below a certain level could see clearly.